Something worth knowing before we begin. The vast majority of those who watch these accounts have never subscribed. If what you hear tonight unsettles you, if it lingers in the back of your skull long after the video ends, consider hitting that button. It costs nothing, and it keeps these chronicles alive. Drop a like. Leave a thought in the comments. And tell me, where are you right now as you listen to this? Because location matters in these stories. It matters more than you think. Have you ever driven through Nevada at 3 in the morning? Not the Vegas corridor with its shrieking neon and tourist delirium, the real Nevada. The kind of landscape where for 60 miles in every cardinal direction, your headlights are the only proof that electricity still exists. A place where the silence is so absolute, so aggressively empty, that you begin to hear the wet rhythm of your own pulse thudding behind your eardrums. Where the darkness doesn't just surround you, it leans against the glass like something patient, something that has been waiting for exactly this vehicle, on exactly this night. That is where a long-haul trucker found himself on a Tuesday in March of 2019. 15 years behind the wheel. Every mile of blacktop between the Pacific Northwest and the Gulf Coast committed to the muscle memory of his hands. He had driven past Area 51 a dozen times before and never spared it a second thought. The restricted signs were just part of the scenery, no different from the faded billboards advertising fireworks or divorce attorneys in the towns he blew through at 70 miles an hour. This time would be different. He was hauling a load of consumer electronics from the Bay Area to Salt Lake City, running Highway 375, the road the tourism board had christened the extraterrestrial highway. A stupid name, he always thought. Bumper sticker nonsense designed to sell keychains to people who believed in little green men. But the route was fast, and he didn't get paid by the hour. He got paid by the delivery. The dashboard clock read 3:17 a.m. when everything changed. 1 second the Kenworth was humming along at a steady 65, the big diesel engine turning over with the reliability of a mechanical heartbeat. The next second the engine began to sputter. Not like fuel starvation. Not like a mechanical seizure with its telltale grinding and smoke. The entire truck simply hesitated, as though something invisible had reached into the machine and gently pressed a palm against the driveshaft, asking it to stop. "Come on, sweetheart," the trucker muttered, tapping the accelerator with practiced calm. The engine responded for half a breath, then hesitated again. The headlights flickered, once, twice, and then everything died. Engine off. Lights extinguished. Dashboard black. The truck rolled forward on pure momentum, tires whispering against asphalt, carrying the 18-wheeler maybe another 100 feet before it settled into complete and absolute stillness. He sat there in the dark, hands still locked on the wheel, knuckles pale against the worn leather. Not quite processing. He had been a trucker for 15 years. Engines did not simply die like that. Not without harbingers, no grinding, no smoke, no temperature spike, no warning light screaming from the instrument cluster. This was just silence, as if the truck had simply decided to stop existing as a machine. He reached for his phone. Dead. Completely dead. The screen refused to illuminate. Even though it had been sitting at 72% charge when he had checked it not 20 minutes prior. "What the hell?" he whispered into the cabin's darkness. That is when he noticed where he had come to rest. His eyes had adjusted enough to make out the road sign roughly 200 yards ahead. White government lettering on green metal, illuminated by nothing but the ancient light of distant stars. Restricted area. Photography prohibited. U.S. Air Force installation. The boundary marker. He had stopped exactly 200 yards from the perimeter of Area 51. His throat went dry. A slow, papery constriction that had nothing to do with the desert air. He had heard the stories, of course. Every long-haul driver had. Lights in the sky above the test ranges. Missing time on the clock. Trucks that refused to turn over anywhere near the military boundaries. He had always dismissed it as heat-addled hallucination, or neglected maintenance blamed on extraterrestrials by men too proud to admit they hadn't checked their alternator. But now here he sat. Truck dead. Phone dead. Alone in the darkness on precisely the wrong stretch of highway, at precisely the wrong hour of the night. He tried the ignition. Nothing. Not even the click of a solenoid engaging. He tried again, pumping the gas pedal as if sheer mechanical insistence could resurrect the engine. Still nothing. The key turned in the cylinder with no resistance and produced no result, like inserting a key into a lock that no longer connected to anything. "Okay," he said aloud, just to hear a human voice occupy the silence. "Okay, think. Batteries dead. Got jumper cables in the toolbox behind the cab. Just need another vehicle." He almost laughed at that. Another vehicle, out here, at 3 in the morning, on a Tuesday, on a highway that averaged maybe 4 cars an hour during the daylight and 0 after midnight. He popped the door handle and stepped down from the cab. The desert air struck him immediately, that bone-deep, arid cold that exists only in places where the sun abandons the ground completely once it sets. He could see his own breath crystallizing in faint, spectral clouds. That was wrong. March in Nevada, even in the small hours, was not supposed to carry this kind of chill. This was a cold that felt placed, deliberate, as though the temperature itself had been adjusted for the occasion. He walked around to the front of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder with sounds that seemed grotesquely amplified. Every footfall was too loud, too present, as if the desert had cupped its hands around its ears and was listening intently to every move he made. That is when he saw the lights. Not headlights. Not stars. 3 distinct points of luminance hovering perhaps 500 feet above the horizon line. They were not moving. Not exactly. They were rotating, slowly, in perfect synchronization, as though fixed to invisible points on an invisible wheel turning in the blackness. White-blue in color. No beams extending from them. No diffuse glow bleeding into the surrounding atmosphere. Just 3 perfect, self-contained spheres of light suspended in the empty sky like punctuation marks in a sentence no human language had written. His hands began to shake. "No," he said, his voice cracking against the silence. "No, no, no. Not real. Heat shimmer. Military flares. Something rational, something explainable, something." But he knew. Somewhere beneath the architecture of rational thought, in the primitive corridors of the brainstem where instinct lived and language had never reached, he knew that those lights were not anything he could explain away. Not flares. Not aircraft. Not reflections or atmospheric distortions or any of the comfortable fictions the conscious mind manufactures when confronted with the incomprehensible. He backed toward his truck without turning around, his eyes locked on the 3 points of light. His hand found the door handle behind him. He pulled. Locked. He pulled harder, fingers white against the chrome. The door had been unlocked 30 seconds ago. He had just stepped out. Hadn't even closed it fully behind him. Now it was sealed, and through the window, he could see the little lock buttons pressed down on both sides of the cab. Every door. Locked from the inside of an empty vehicle. The lights in the sky began to descend. Not rapidly. Not with any urgency that could be mistaken for aggression. They lowered with a slow, deliberate patience, like something curious, something that had noticed the solitary figure standing on the asphalt below, and simply wanted a closer look at the man who was alone on the highway at 3 in the morning with nowhere to go. He ran. There was no decision involved, no conscious calculation of odds or direction. His legs simply fired, and he was moving. Away from the truck, away from the lights, away from the restricted area sign, boots slapping against the asphalt in a frantic, graceless sprint, breath tearing from his lungs in sharp, ragged gasps. He ran with a desperation he had not felt since adolescence, every muscle engaged, every nerve screaming a single imperative: distance. Behind him, nothing. No engine roar. No helicopter rotors. No wind displacement. Just silence, vast and predatory, chasing him down the center line of the empty highway like a living thing. He made it perhaps 200 yards before he realized something was wrong with the running itself. His legs were pumping. His arms were driving forward and back. But the road beneath his feet was not passing at the speed it should have been. It was as though the asphalt had become viscous, as though invisible resistance had been applied to the air around him. Not touching him, not restraining him physically, but slowing him, the way a current slows a swimmer who cannot see the water pulling against them. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The lights were directly above his truck now, perhaps 100 feet in altitude. They had ceased their descent and simply hovered there, rotating in their slow, mechanical rhythm, bathing the entire stretch of highway in that strange white-blue luminance that did not behave the way light was supposed to behave. It did not spread. It did not scatter. It illuminated nothing beyond its own geometry. And then he saw the figure, standing beside his truck, in the exact spot where the trucker himself had been standing 60 seconds earlier, was a shape. His brain attempted to categorize it as a person. It possessed the general architecture: a head, a torso, arms, legs. But the proportions were wrong. Profoundly, viscerally wrong. Too tall, 7 feet at minimum, possibly more. And thin. Not emaciated. Not skeletal. Thin in a way that suggested someone had taken a standard human template and stretched it vertically, elongating every dimension, making everything narrower and more angular, as though the body had been designed for a world with different gravity. The figure was motionless, just standing there, watching him. He stopped running. Not by choice. His legs simply ceased to function, locking mid-stride with a mechanical finality that nearly pitched him face-first onto the asphalt. He caught himself with his hands, stumbled, righted his balance, and found that he could no longer move. Forward was impossible. Backward was impossible. He could barely expand his lungs enough to breathe. Only his eyes still obeyed him, and his heart, hammering against his ribs with such violence that he could feel it in his teeth. The figure took a step toward him. Then another. The movement was wrong, not walking as humans walk, with the natural sway and bounce of bipedal locomotion. This was gliding, feet barely grazing the ground. No weight transfer, no momentum, just smooth, frictionless displacement from one point to the next, as though the figure were being moved by something other than its own muscles. He tried to scream. His jaw opened. His diaphragm contracted. But no sound emerged. His vocal cords had been switched off as cleanly as his truck's engine. Nothing worked. Nothing except his eyes, still locked on the approaching shape, and his mind, which was screaming at a frequency no one could hear. Run, run, run. The figure stopped approximately 20 feet away. At this distance, details resolved through the darkness with terrible clarity. It wore something dark, a garment that resembled a suit in silhouette, but the material refused to interact with light correctly. It did not reflect. It did not shimmer. It absorbed, swallowing every photon that touched its surface as though the fabric were woven from the absence of visibility itself. The face was pale, almost luminescent, carrying its own faint inner glow like deep-sea bioluminescence. The eyes were large, 2 of them, proportioned like a human's but scaled upward, dark and reflective as polished obsidian. No discernible nose. A mouth that was barely a seam in the lower face, a thin horizontal line that conveyed no expression. It tilted its head, studying him with the detached precision of a researcher examining a new specimen. Then it raised one hand. Long fingers, 4 of them, without nails, without joints that bent at familiar angles. The hand came up slowly, palm facing the trucker. The gesture could have been a greeting. It could have been a command. It communicated nothing he could decode and everything he could feel. Stay still. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound, that mundane, electronic vibration, shattered whatever invisible architecture had been holding him in place. His legs unlocked. His lungs filled with cold desert air in a gasping, desperate inhalation. He stumbled backward, nearly falling over his own boots, arms pinwheeling for balance. The figure did not react. It remained exactly where it stood, hand raised, head tilted, dark eyes reflecting the white-blue glow from above, as motionless and patient as a monument. The trucker pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. The screen was alive again, glowing with the familiar blue-white of a functioning device. The clock read 3:19 a.m. 2 minutes. Only 2 minutes had elapsed since his truck had died. That was impossible. He had been standing there, frozen, paralyzed, for at least 10 minutes. Perhaps longer. He had felt the time pass, the slow, agonizing crawl of seconds while the figure approached. 10 minutes, 15, an eternity compressed into a space that the clock insisted had lasted 120 seconds. When he looked up from the phone, the figure was gone. The lights were gone. His truck sat on the highway exactly where it had stopped. No glow surrounding it. No strange silhouettes beside it. Just an 18-wheeler parked on the center line of an empty road in the Nevada dark, as ordinary and explicable as anything he had ever seen. He stood there shaking, the phone clutched in his white-knuckled grip, trying to reassemble the last 2 minutes into something that obeyed the laws of the world he had always known. Trying to convince himself that none of it had been real. Heat exhaustion, in March. Carbon monoxide accumulation in the cab. Microsleep hallucination from too many hours on the road. Something, anything, that could be written on an incident report and filed away in a drawer and never thought about again. His phone buzzed a second time. A text message from his wife. "Drive safe, honey. Love you." Sent at 11:47 p.m., nearly 5 hours ago. Only just now arriving, as though the signal had been held somewhere in the dark and released only when the lights departed. He walked back to his truck on legs that felt borrowed from someone else. The door opened easily, unlocked, compliant, as though it had never resisted him. The keys hung in the ignition where he had left them. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. Smooth. Immediate. Perfect. As though nothing had ever been wrong with it. Dashboard lights bloomed across the instrument panel. The radio crackled back to the classic rock station he had been listening to before the world had gone silent. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. The truck ran as reliably as it had for 200,000 miles before this night. He sat for a long moment, hands on the wheel, engine idling, staring through the windshield at the empty road ahead, trying to decide what to do. Call someone, and tell them what? That he had seen 3 lights and a 7-foot figure made of angles and silence beside his truck on the extraterrestrial highway? They would think he had lost his mind. He would think he had lost his mind. He put the truck in gear and drove. He did not stop until he reached a gas station in Tonopah, 70 miles southwest, where he pulled into the parking lot and sat in his illuminated cab with every light burning until the sun climbed above the eastern mountains and made the darkness retreat. He never told anyone what happened that night. Not his wife. Not his dispatcher. Not the other drivers when they traded stories over gas station coffee and stale pastries. He carried it silently, the way you carry a wound that hasn't started bleeding yet, aware of it constantly, afraid to touch it, afraid that acknowledging it would make it real in ways he was not prepared to survive. But he never drove Highway 375 again. Even though the detour added 2 hours to every Salt Lake City run. Even though his dispatcher complained about the fuel costs and the schedule delays. Even though he could never articulate a reason that would satisfy anyone who asked. Some roads are not worth the time they save. And some silences, once broken, never fully close again. The perimeter guard heard the trucker's story 3 months later, though he did not know that was what he was hearing at the time. It came to him in fragments, Second-hand rumors passed between security contractors at a shift change briefing, stripped of names and specifics, reduced to the kind of vague anecdote that men in uniform trade when the nights are long and the silence needs filling. A trucker whose rig had died on Highway 375. Lights that shouldn't have been there. A door that locked itself. He'd filed it alongside 100 other desert legends and thought nothing more of it. The guard worked security for a private military contractor, not the kind of security that involved sitting in a climate-controlled booth checking identification badges against a laminated roster. The kind where you drove a blacked-out patrol vehicle through miles of restricted terrain in the dead of night and did not ask questions about what you were guarding. He had been doing it for 7 years. The compensation was excellent. The benefits were generous. And he did not mind the isolation the way some men did. The desert drove certain personalities toward fracture, the emptiness working on them like water on limestone, dissolving the structures they had built to hold themselves together. But the guard found it peaceful. Just him, his vehicle, his rifle, and an ocean of government land where no one was supposed to exist. His assigned sector covered approximately 30 square miles of buffer zone northwest of Groom Lake. That was the official designation, not Area 51. That name belonged to tourists and conspiracy theorists and late-night television hosts who said it with theatrical gravity, as though the words themselves were classified. The actual facility was simply Groom Lake, or Homey Airport, or the detachment attached to Nellis Air Force Base. Names as bland as the bureaucracy that administered them. His responsibilities were uncomplicated. Drive the perimeter road. Scan for trespassers. Report anything unusual. In practice, unusual meant people. Hikers who had wandered past the boundary markers without reading them. Photographers with telephoto lenses and delusions of capturing something classified. The occasional inebriated tourist from Las Vegas who had somehow convinced himself that Area 51 was an amusement park with an admission fee and a gift shop. The guard had intercepted all of these and more over his 7 years on the contract. He had never seen anything actually unusual. No unidentified aircraft. No experimental technology visible from the ground. No extraterrestrial visitors. Just mile after mile of scrubland, alkali flats, and the occasional coyote trotting through his headlight beams with its eyes glowing amber. The alien mythology was background noise, present, persistent, and entirely irrelevant to the work. Until June 14, 2019. The guard was running his standard patrol, Route 7, the northeastern quadrant. Dashboard clock reading 2:43 a.m. He had the route memorized with the unconscious precision of a man who had driven it several hundred times. 32 miles of packed dirt road forming a rough rectangle through the basin, taking approximately 90 minutes if you maintained speed and didn't stop for anything. He was on the long straight stretch, the segment that ran parallel to Highway 375, roughly 3 miles to the west, when he saw the lights. His first assumption was a vehicle on the public highway. Headlights in the distance, a truck, maybe, or a recreational vehicle carrying insomniacs toward whatever waited at the far end of the state. But the lights were wrong. They sat too high above the horizon for ground-level traffic, and they did not produce the familiar cone-shaped beam pattern of automotive headlamps. They were too bright, too focused, too still. He eased off the accelerator and let his patrol vehicle coast, squinting through the windshield into the darkness beyond the buffer zone. The lights resolved into clarity as his eyes adjusted. 3 of them, arranged in a triangular formation, hovering perhaps a quarter-mile distant. White-blue in color, intensely bright, but the illumination they produced did not behave correctly. It did not diffuse. It did not spill outward into the surrounding atmosphere the way floodlights or aircraft beacons would. Each light existed as a self-contained point, casting no shadows, creating no ambient glow, as though the photons they emitted had been instructed to travel only so far and no farther. He had seen military flares before. Night exercises over the test ranges produced all manner of aerial pyrotechnics. But flares were governed by gravity. They arced, they drifted, they descended. These lights simply hung in the black air with the fixed permanence of stars that had wandered too close to the ground. The guard reached for his radio with practiced calm. His voice, when he spoke, carried the flat, procedural cadence of a man reporting weather conditions. Control, this is Mobile 7. I've got visual on 3 unidentified lights, sector northeast, approximately 6 miles from the highway border. Requesting confirmation of any scheduled exercises in the area. Static answered him, the familiar crackle of encrypted radio seeking a handshake with a bass repeater. Then the dispatcher's voice, clear and neutral. Mobile 7, no exercises scheduled for your sector. Can you describe the lights? 3 stationary lights in triangular formation. Bright, white-blue color. No visible source structure. Not moving. More static. A longer pause than protocol dictated. When the voice returned, it had changed. The casual professionalism replaced by something more formal, more guarded, as though the dispatcher were now reading from a script he had hoped never to use. Mobile 7, maintain your position and continue observation. Do not approach. Confirm acknowledgement. Acknowledged. Maintaining position. The guard placed the radio back in its cradle and watched the lights through his windshield. His engine idled beneath him. His headlights pointed toward the phenomenon, their beams dying in the darkness long before reaching whatever hovered out there in the basin. He had been trained for a comprehensive range of scenarios: armed trespassers, medical emergencies, vehicle accidents, even active shooter situations within the perimeter. Nobody had ever briefed him on what to do if he observed unidentified aerial phenomena, because such phenomena were not supposed to exist. The official position, the position repeated in every training manual and every contractor briefing, was that the alien mythology surrounding Groom Lake was disinformation, useful cover for experimental aircraft programs and classified military projects. If you saw something unusual in the sky, you were looking at the next generation of stealth technology or autonomous drone systems. That was the explanation. That had always been sufficient. The lights began to move. Not toward him. Laterally, gliding from left to right across his field of vision with fluid, unhurried grace. They maintained their triangular formation with absolute geometric precision, each light holding its position relative to the others as though the 3 points were welded to a single invisible frame. And they were silent. Completely, impossibly silent. No engine noise. No rotor wash. No atmospheric displacement. Even at this distance, something moving that size should have produced something audible. A hum, a vibration, a disturbance in the still desert air. There was nothing. Just 3 lights sliding across the darkness like luminous fish moving through deep water. The guard seized his radio again. Control. Lights are moving. Heading southeast. Still no sound. No identifiable propulsion signature. Acknowledged. Mobile 7. Continue observation. The lights passed behind a low ridge, one of the ancient geological folds that creased the basin floor like wrinkles in old skin, and vanished from sight. The guard waited, counting seconds with the disciplined patience of a man accustomed to long hours of nothing. The trajectory should carry them past the ridge and into open terrain within 10 seconds. He would see them emerge on the far side, and then he would have a better angle to estimate altitude and distance. 10 seconds passed. The far side of the ridge remained dark. 20 seconds. Nothing. 30. The lights had not reappeared. Control, I've lost visual. Lights went behind the northern ridge and did not emerge on the far side. They should have cleared it by now. Acknowledged. Mobile 7. Proceed to the ridge and investigate. The guard's hand hesitated over the gear shift. Something cold moved through his chest. Not fear exactly, but the faint tremor of a professional instinct warning him that the situation had shifted into territory his training did not cover. Control, you just told me not to approach. Proceed to the ridge, Mobile 7. That's an order. Something in the dispatcher's voice was wrong. The cadence had flattened further, too even, too measured, emptied of the small human imperfections that normally texture speech. It sounded like a voice being worn rather than used. But orders were orders, and 7 years of contractor discipline overrode the unease crawling up his spine. He shifted into gear and drove toward the ridge. The dirt road curved around the geological formation, adding roughly 3 minutes to his approach. He kept his eyes on the area where the lights had disappeared, scanning the darkness for any residual glow, any trace of movement. There was nothing. The ridge sat in its ancient silence, indifferent to whatever had passed behind it. He reached the base of the ridge and brought the vehicle to a stop. The area was quiet, profoundly, unnervingly quiet. No wind, no insects, no distant coyote calls. Just the tick of his cooling engine and the sound of his own breathing, both of which seemed too loud for the space they occupied, as though the desert had drawn a breath and was holding it. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the vehicle. The air was still and cold and tasted faintly of minerals, the ancient chemistry of alkali flats releasing their stored heat into the atmosphere. He swept the flashlight beam across the ridge face. Rocks, scrub brush, compacted earth the color of bone. Nothing unusual, nothing that didn't belong to the 10,000-year-old geology of the Great Basin. Then he noticed his truck. The engine had been running when he exited. He could remember the low, reliable idle of the diesel turning over, the dashboard instruments glowing their familiar amber and green. But now the vehicle sat in complete darkness behind him. Engine silent. Headlights dead. Dashboard extinguished. As though someone had reached under the hood and disconnected the battery while his back was turned. "What the hell?" he muttered, turning and walking back toward it. He reached for the driver's door handle and pulled. Locked. All 4 doors, locked tight, the mechanism sealed with the same inexplicable finality the trucker had encountered 3 months earlier on Highway 375. Through the window, he could see his keys hanging in the ignition, his radio sitting in its cradle on the center console, his rifle secured in its rack behind the seats. Everything inside. Everything inaccessible. Training overrode panic. Stay calm. Assess the situation. Radio for support. He reached for the radio on his belt, the handheld backup unit he carried for exactly this kind of contingency. His hand found an empty clip. The radio wasn't there. He must have left it in the vehicle, sitting on the passenger seat where he sometimes placed it during patrols. "Okay," he said, speaking aloud the way people do when they need to hear a human voice and their own is the only one available. "Okay. Not great, but manageable. Find a rock. Break the window. Get the door open. Call it in. Standard procedure." He scanned the ground for something heavy enough to shatter tempered glass. A suitable stone, maybe, or a piece of the old mining debris that littered the basin floor. That was when he realized he could see. Not by flashlight, he had dropped it when he'd reached for his missing radio. The beam lay on the ground a few feet away, pointing uselessly at a patch of dirt. He could see because there was light. That same white-blue luminance, soft and directionless, emanating from somewhere behind him, washing over the ridge and the scrub brush and the dead truck with a glow that seemed to come from no single point, as though the air itself had begun to fluoresce. The guard turned around slowly. The motion felt ceremonial, as though his body understood that what waited behind him would divide his life into before and after, and it wanted to mark the threshold. The 3 lights were back, but they were no longer distant. They hovered perhaps 50 feet from where he stood, suspended at roughly eye level, close enough now that their nature was unmistakable. They were not lights. They were windows. 3 perfectly circular apertures set into the surface of something enormous and dark and absolutely silent. The glow radiated from within, a soft, blue-white interior illumination that spilled through the circular openings but did not project outward, did not touch the ground, did not behave like light escaping a structure should behave. It simply existed within its own boundaries, contained and self-referencing, as though the photons understood they were not meant to leave. The guard's mind could not fully process the shape of the craft. His visual cortex kept attempting to resolve it into familiar geometry and failing. The angles were wrong, the proportions contradictory, surfaces appearing to curve and flatten simultaneously like an Escher print rendered in physical matter. It was like trying to perceive a three-dimensional object through a two-dimensional frame. The brain received the data but could not assemble it into coherent form. But he could see the windows. And through the windows, he could see movement. Figures, tall and impossibly thin, moving past the circular apertures with a fluid, unhurried gait of passengers traversing the corridor of a vessel. They passed the windows in silhouette, elongated heads, narrow torsos, limbs that seemed too long for the bodies they served, each one visible for a moment before gliding out of the frame and being replaced by the next. One of the figures stopped. It turned toward the window, toward the guard, and it looked at him. The guard felt something enter his mind. Not a voice, not language, not the structured sequence of words and grammar that constitutes communication between humans. It was a presence, a foreign awareness pressing against the interior walls of his consciousness like a hand testing the surface of a membrane. Someone had opened a door inside his skull and stepped through it without asking, without knocking, without any of the courtesies that govern the boundary between one mind and another. Curiosity. That was the dominant sensation bleeding through the contact. Not hostility, not threat, not the predatory focus of something that intended harm. Just curiosity, vast, clinical, detached, the way a xenobiologist might regard an interesting specimen discovered in an unexpected habitat. Interest without empathy, observation without investment. The guard tried to move. His legs had locked again. That same invisible paralysis, that same severance of the connection between intention and execution. His arms hung at his sides, nerveless and heavy. Only his eyes still functioned, locked on the figure in the window, on the dark reflective surfaces where its eyes should have been. The presence in his head intensified. It was searching now, moving through his memories with the methodical efficiency of fingers flipping through files in a cabinet. His childhood in a small Midwestern town. His military service, boot camp, deployment, the particular smell of diesel fuel and sand that he associated with his years overseas. His daughter's 6th birthday party, the pink streamers, the cake shaped like a butterfly, her laughter when the candles wouldn't stay lit. His divorce, the silence in the apartment afterward, the way certain rooms felt larger when only one person occupied them. Everything examined with that same vast, clinical curiosity. Everything catalogued and filed and understood by something that had no context for any of it but wanted to learn. Then it stopped. The presence withdrew, not gradually, not with any transition, but instantly, like a hand pulling back from a flame. And in its wake, it left a hollow, an emptiness inside his skull that felt architectural, as though something had been carefully removed, and the space it had occupied now echoed with its absence. The figure in the window moved away. The interior glow shifted as the shapes within the craft resumed their transit through whatever corridors existed inside that impossible geometry. His radio crackled to life on the ground near his truck. The voice that emerged from the speaker was not the dispatcher. It was higher in pitch, smoother, stripped of the micro-imperfections that identify a human larynx. It sounded constructed rather than produced, each syllable placed with the precision of a machine that had studied speech without ever having needed to breathe. Mobile 7, return to base. Report equipment malfunction. No further investigation required. The lights accelerated. Straight up, not at an angle, not along any trajectory that obeyed the physics of aeronautical movement, but directly vertical, as though gravity had simply been cancelled for the object and it was falling upward into the sky. The acceleration was instantaneous and absolute. One moment the craft was 50 feet away, filling his field of vision with its impossible geometry. The next it was a point of light among the stars. And then it was gone entirely, swallowed by the upper atmosphere in less than 2 seconds. His legs unlocked. The guard collapsed to his knees, gasping, lungs heaving, hands pressing into the cold dirt, the hollow feeling in his head slowly, unevenly filling back in with his own thoughts, his own memories, his own sense of self. It was like waking from anesthesia, the world returning in fragments, each piece clicking back into place with a small, disorienting jolt. His truck's engine turned over behind him. The sound was sudden and startling, the diesel catching and settling into its familiar idle, as though it had simply been paused rather than killed. Headlights bloomed across the ridge face. Dashboard instruments glowed amber and green. He stood up on legs that felt newly assembled and looked at his vehicle. All 4 doors were unlocked now. The keys hung in the ignition, turned to the run position. His radio sat in its cradle, the channel indicator showing the standard frequency. Everything in its place. Everything operational. As though he checked his watch, 4 minutes had not happened. 2:47 a.m. For minutes since he had first seen the lights. 4 minutes. It had felt like an hour. The approach, the paralysis, the presence ransacking his memories, the withdrawal, the acceleration. All of it compressed into 240 seconds that his watch had faithfully counted, while his subjective experience insisted that time had dilated far beyond its measured passage. The guard climbed into his truck, put it in gear, and drove back toward base. He did not transmit on the radio. He did not file an incident report through the mobile terminal. When his supervisor met him at the gate and asked about the night patrol, a routine question, asked with routine disinterest, the guard said that everything had been quiet. Equipment performed normally. No incidents. No trespassers. No anomalies of any kind. He completed the paperwork. Signed the log. Drove home to his apartment in the nearest town, 40 minutes south, where he parked in his assigned space and sat behind the wheel for a long time without going inside. The hollow feeling persisted. It sat behind his eyes like a low-grade headache. Not painful, but present, a constant reminder that something had been inside his head, had opened drawers and examined the contents and put most of them back. Most of them. Because something felt slightly misaligned, slightly displaced, as though certain memories had been returned to the wrong shelves and now sat at unfamiliar angles in his consciousness. 3 weeks later, the guard submitted his resignation. He told his supervisors he had received a more attractive offer from a private firm in California. This was a lie, but it was a clean one, the kind that invited no follow-up questions and required no elaboration. He did not mention that he could no longer drive past the northern ridge without his hands beginning to shake on the steering wheel, a fine tremor that started in his fingers and worked inward until his forearms ached with the effort of holding steady. He did not mention the dreams, vivid, architectural dreams in which tall, thin figures moved through the corridors of his memory like tourists in a museum, pausing at certain exhibits, studying them with that same detached curiosity, then moving on to the next. He did not mention the hollow feeling, which had not faded in 3 weeks and which he was beginning to suspect would never fade entirely, that it was not a wound healing but a permanent alteration, a room added to the architecture of his mind that he had not built and could not furnish and would never fully understand. Some jobs are not worth the benefits package, and some doors, once opened from the outside, never fully close again. The thing about the Nevada desert is that it is not empty. Not truly. Tourists see it from the windows of air-conditioned rental cars and perceive a void, sand, rock, scrub brush, and the absence of everything else. But people who actually live out here, who have surrendered to the landscape and allowed it to become the architecture of their daily existence, know differently. There are dozens of small towns scattered across the state like seeds dropped from the hand of someone who lost interest halfway through the planting. Some appear on maps. Some do not. Places where a few hundred people, sometimes fewer, sustain themselves through mining, ranching, or servicing the occasional highway traveler who has taken a wrong turn or a deliberate one. Rachel, Nevada, was one of these towns. Population 54. 1 bar. 1 motel. A gas station that operated on a schedule best described as aspirational, open more often than not, closed whenever the owner decided the day had offered enough. The town's only claim to relevance was its proximity to the restricted perimeter of Area 51 and the presence of a small roadside establishment, part restaurant, part motel, part shrine to extraterrestrial mythology, that catered to the steady trickle of UFO enthusiasts who made the pilgrimage to this particular stretch of emptiness in hopes of seeing something that would confirm their belief that humanity was not alone. The local artist had moved to Rachel 3 years earlier to escape Las Vegas. She had wanted quiet, isolation, A place where the sheer weight of other people's noise and proximity and expectation did not press against her skull from the moment she woke until the moment she managed, exhausted, to sleep. She had wanted a landscape that did not demand anything from her except her presence within it. She got more isolation than she had bargained for. She ran the gas station. It was not much of a career, more of an arrangement between herself and the station's absentee owner, who lived in Reno and couldn't be bothered to find anyone else willing to operate a fuel pump in a town with fewer residents than a mid-sized apartment building. But it paid enough for her small trailer and left her with hours of unstructured time in which to paint. She had come to Nevada to be an artist, and there was something about the desert light, the way it changed character every hour, shifting from amber to white to gold to a bruised violet, that made the mountains look like the spines of sleeping animals, that made her canvases come alive in ways they never had under the flat, filtered light of the city. She had heard the UFO stories. You could not live in Rachel without hearing them. They were woven into the town's conversational fabric, the way weather talk was woven into farming communities. Lights in the sky above the restricted zones. Strange craft moving in ways that aircraft should not move. Missing time, where minutes vanished from clocks and watches without explanation. The local artist dismissed most of it as commercial mythology. The town drew a meaningful percentage of its revenue from alien enthusiasts, and encouraging the legends was simply good business practice. Believe what you want. Buy a t-shirt on your way out. But after 3 years of living alone in the desert, she had begun to notice things. Small things. The kind of observations that individually meant nothing but collectively formed a pattern she could not quite dismiss. Her car battery would drain completely overnight approximately once a month, always on nights when the moon was full, always without explanation, always requiring a jump start from the ranch hand who lived 2 miles down the road and never asked questions about why it kept happening. Sometimes, at 3 in the morning, she would hear a low humming sound that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. A frequency felt more in the chest cavity than heard through the eardrums, like standing too close to a power transformer, except there were no transformers within miles. And the wildlife would vanish. Not gradually, the way animals migrate or retreat from weather changes, but completely. Every jackrabbit, every lizard, every bird gone from the landscape for 2 or 3 days, as though some signal had been broadcast on a frequency only they could receive, telling them to leave. Then they would return, all at once, as suddenly as they had disappeared. The local artist did not believe in UFOs. But she was beginning to believe that there was something in the desert, something the government was testing, probably. Some kind of electromagnetic pulse weapon or advanced drone technology that produced side effects the military either couldn't or didn't bother to mitigate. That was her working theory. That was what she told herself during the humming nights and the dead battery mornings, and it was sufficient to keep the architecture of her rational worldview intact. On August 2, 2019, she closed the gas station at 9 p.m. as she always did. She had served exactly 3 customers over the course of the day. A family passing through to California who had needed fuel and a restroom, and who had looked at the desert around them with the bewildered expressions of people who could not fathom why anyone would choose to live here. A trucker getting diesel who had paid in cash and said nothing, and one of the ranch hands from the nearby cattle operation picking up cigarettes and a 6-pack. She drove her aging sedan the 2 miles to her trailer, parked on the patch of hard-packed earth that served as her driveway, and went inside. Dinner was leftover pizza reheated until the cheese bubbled, and a beer cold enough to make the bottle sweat. Entertainment was a novel she had read twice before, familiar enough to require no concentration, engaging enough to prevent the silence from becoming a sound of its own. This was her routine, and she treasured it the way some people treasure conversation, or music, or the presence of another heartbeat in the room. She had chosen solitude deliberately, and she inhabited it with the practiced comfort of someone who understood that loneliness and aloneness were different countries entirely. She went to bed at 11. She woke at 3:17 a.m. Not to a noise, not to a movement or a vibration or any of the physical stimuli that ordinarily drag consciousness out of sleep. She woke to a feeling, a shift in the atmospheric pressure inside her trailer, subtle but unmistakable, as though someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed. The air felt different, heavier, charged with a static quality that made the fine hairs on her forearms stand upright and her scalp tighten. She lay in bed listening. Her trailer was old, a single wide from the late 90s that had been manufactured without regard for insulation or structural integrity, and it made sounds when the desert temperature changed. Metal contracting, joints settling, the soft artillery of a structure arguing with its own materials. But this was not that. This was the opposite of sound. This was silence, a silence so dense and total that it felt manufactured. No insects, no wind threading through the gaps in the window frames, no distant rumble of a truck on Highway 375. Nothing. As though every source of ambient noise within a mile radius had been simultaneously switched off. She got out of bed and crossed to the window. Her trailer faced east, toward the highway and the dark immensity of the desert beyond it. The sky was wrong. Not the whole sky, just a portion of it, perhaps a mile from her trailer, where a dome of soft white-blue light rose from the desert floor like a luminous blister on the skin of the earth. It had no visible source, no beams projecting it upward, no structure beneath it generating the glow. It simply existed, a hemisphere of pale radiance imposed upon the darkness, illuminating nothing but itself. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand. No signal, but that was not unusual in Rachel, where cellular coverage was more theoretical than practical. What was unusual was that the phone itself was frozen. The screen displayed 3:17 a.m. in static digits that refused to advance, and the touch interface did not respond to her fingers. The device was not off. It was suspended, caught in some intermediate state between function and failure, like a clock whose pendulum had been gently held mid-swing. She turned from the window to grab her car keys from the kitchen counter, already forming a plan: drive to the gas station, use the landline, call someone, anyone, and stopped. There was a figure standing in her living room. Tall, 7 feet at minimum, perhaps more. Its head nearly brushing the ceiling of the trailer, which had not been designed to accommodate anything taller than average human proportion. Thin in that same impossible way, elongated, angular, as though the blueprint for a human body had been fed through a machine that stretched every measurement along the vertical axis. The head was large relative to the torso, smooth and hairless, tapering slightly at the chin. The eyes dominated the face, enormous, dark, reflective, occupying the space where a human face would distribute multiple features among eyes and nose and cheekbones. The nose was vestigial at best, a slight ridge rather than a protrusion. The mouth was a thin, horizontal line that conveyed no expression and offered no indication of whether the thing behind it was capable of producing sound. It wore something that resembled a suit in the loosest sense, a dark gray garment that covered the body from neck to ankle. But the material defied visual comprehension. It shifted in the dim light of the trailer, its texture oscillating between matte and glossy, smooth and fibrous, as though it could not decide what physical properties it wanted to possess, or as though it possessed all of them simultaneously, and the human eye could only perceive one state at a time. The local artist's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, involuntary contraction that sealed her airway as effectively as a hand around her neck. Her first instinct was to scream, and she felt the scream build, felt it rise from her diaphragm, climb through her chest, press against the walls of her larynx, and die there. The sound simply ceased to exist before it reached the air, as though her vocal cords had been delicately disconnected from the impulse that commanded them. The figure tilted its head. The gesture was deliberate and unhurried, a slow rotation of that oversized cranium on the thin axis of its neck, studying her with the same detached fascination a lepidopterist might bring to an unfamiliar species pinned under glass. Then it raised one hand, long fingers extended, palm facing her. The gesture seemed almost apologetic, as though the figure understood that its presence constituted a violation and wished to acknowledge that fact before proceeding with whatever it had come to do. Images flooded her mind. Not words, not language, not the structured sequence of symbols that humans use to encode meaning. These were pictures, vivid, high resolution, saturated with emotional undertone, projected directly into her visual cortex with a clarity that made her own memories look like watercolors left in the rain. We mean no harm. Need to understand. You are safe. The message arrived not as a sentence but as a simultaneous experience. The concept of harmlessness felt as warmth, the concept of understanding felt as gentle pressure, the concept of safety felt as stillness. The presence behind the images was gentle but insistent, like a hand on a shoulder that was both comforting and impossible to shrug off. She felt herself relaxing. Not voluntarily. Her conscious mind was still screaming behind its glass partition, still pounding against the walls of a body that was no longer entirely hers to command. But something deeper was responding to the contact. Her heartbeat slowed. Her breathing steadied. Her muscles unclenched one by one, as though the presence in her mind had found the switchboard that governed her autonomic nervous system and was methodically turning down every alarm. The figure gestured toward the trailer door. The local artist walked toward it. Not because she chose to. Her legs simply activated and carried her forward while her conscious awareness observed from a position of detached spectatorship, a passenger in her own body, watching the landscape scroll past through windows she could not open. The door swung outward before she reached it, opening onto the desert night without any hand touching it. Outside, the world had been transformed. The desert was bathed in that white-blue luminance she had seen through her window, but standing within it was different from observing it at a distance. The light had texture. It pressed against her skin like a faint electric current, producing a tingling sensation that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant but profoundly unfamiliar, as though her nerve endings were registering a stimulus they had no existing category for. The source of the glow hung above the desert floor, perhaps 100 feet up and a quarter-mile east of her trailer. A craft, though the word felt inadequate, a child's vocabulary applied to something that existed beyond the boundaries of human engineering. It was not saucer-shaped. It was not disc-shaped. It was not any shape that science fiction had prepared her to expect. It was a series of interlocking geometric forms, triangles nested within spheres, polyhedra rotating within frames that should not have been able to contain them, and looking at it directly produced a physical discomfort in her eyes, a sensation of wrongness, as though the visual information was too complex for her optic nerves to decode without strain. The angles did not belong to Euclidean space. The surfaces curved in directions that three-dimensional geometry did not accommodate. It existed, and it was real, and it hurt to look at in the way that staring at the sun hurts, not because of brightness but because the human eye was never designed to process what it was seeing. There were more figures outside. 5 of them, standing in a loose semicircle around her trailer, motionless and watchful, their dark eyes reflecting the glow from the craft above. They all shared the same fundamental architecture, tall, thin, oversized craniums, vestigial features, but the local artist could somehow distinguish between them. Different heights, different proportions. Subtle variations in the angle of the head, the width of the shoulders, the length of the fingers. Individuals. Not copies. Not a uniform species rendered in identical molds, but distinct beings with distinct physical identities, as recognizable to each other, she suspected, as human faces were to humans. One of them approached her. It was slightly shorter than the others, still towering by human standards, but noticeably smaller within its own kind, and something about its posture communicated a quality she could only interpret as uncertainty. A tentativeness in the way it moved. A slight hesitation before each step, as though it were performing a procedure it had rehearsed but not yet mastered. Younger, she thought, if these things experienced age. An apprentice. A student. Something new to this work. It reached out and touched her forehead with one long, pale finger. The contact was cold. Not temperature cold, not the bite of metal in winter or the shock of ice against skin. A different cold. A categorical cold, like touching something that did not fully inhabit the same physical reality as her body. The point of contact felt thin, as though the barrier between her nervous system and whatever the figure was had narrowed to a membrane 1 molecule thick. More images, clearer this time, more detailed, projected with the confidence of a being who was learning to calibrate its signal to the receiver. Earth from orbit. The planet turning slowly against the black velvet of space, cloud formations spiraling across blue oceans, continents lit at night with the golden tracery of human civilization. Cities. Highways. The nervous system of a species rendered visible from sufficient altitude. Then closer. Forests dense and ancient, canopies so thick that the ground beneath them existed in permanent twilight. Oceans where the water was so deep that sunlight died long before reaching the bottom. Mountains with snow on their peaks and fire in their roots. Then closer still. People, going about the unremarkable theater of daily life. Cars on highways. Children in playgrounds. A woman hanging laundry in a backyard while a dog slept in the shade of a tree. A man reading a newspaper at a kitchen table, coffee steaming beside his hand. We study. We learn. We remember. The young one pulled its finger back from her forehead. Something radiated from it, an emotion transmitted through the fading contact, warm and unmistakable even through the alien grammar of its expression. Pride. The satisfaction of having performed a task correctly, of having made the connection without causing damage, of having shown the subject what it was meant to see. The local artist recognized that feeling, had felt it herself the first time a painting came together exactly as she had envisioned it, when the gap between intention and execution closed to nothing. The taller figure, the one from inside her trailer, the first one, the one whose presence carried the weight of authority, moved closer. When it touched her forehead, the contact was firmer, more assured, and the images came faster, harder, in a torrent that overwhelmed her visual processing and spilled into other senses. She saw cities that were not on Earth. Structures that rose from landscapes under skies lit by stars the wrong color. Too red, too blue, too numerous, arranged in constellations that no human astronomer had ever catalogued. She saw beings that were and were not like the ones standing around her. Variations on the same theme, the way dogs and wolves are variations, recognizable as kin but shaped by different pressures over different epochs. She saw technology that made no sense, devices that appeared to be simultaneously solid and liquid, mechanical and biological, as though the distinction between tool and organism had been dissolved. She saw biology that violated every rule she had ever absorbed from textbooks and documentaries, organisms that photosynthesized thought, that reproduced through sound, that existed in states of matter she had no name for. And then she saw Earth again, but different, older, younger, both simultaneously. She was seeing time itself move, watching the continents drift like foam on the surface of a slowly stirred liquid, the ice ages advancing and retreating like the breath of a sleeping giant, the forests rising and falling and rising again. She watched humanity emerge from the African savanna, spread across the continents, build and destroy and rebuild, each iteration slightly different, slightly more complex, slightly more dangerous to itself and everything around it. She watched civilizations bloom and wither with the compressed beauty of time-lapse flowers, pyramids rising from desert sand, cathedrals climbing toward gray European skies, cities of glass and steel erupting along coastlines that would one day be underwater. We have always watched. We will always watch. You are not alone in the universe. You have never been alone. The connection severed. Not gently, abruptly, like a cable being pulled from a socket, leaving the local artist stumbling backward with her vision blurred and her equilibrium shattered. Her head spun. Her inner ear produced conflicting signals. For a moment, the desert tilted around her like the deck of a ship in heavy weather, and she thought she would fall. When her vision cleared, the figures were withdrawing, moving back toward the craft with that fluid, frictionless glide, feet not quite touching the ground, bodies producing no shadow despite the light that surrounded them. A ramp had materialized on the underside of the craft. It had not extended or deployed in any mechanical sense. It was simply there, as though it had always existed and she had only now been granted the perceptual framework to notice it. They ascended in single file. The taller ones first, moving with purpose and economy, each one disappearing into the interior glow without pause or hesitation. The young one was last. It reached the top of the ramp and stopped, turned, looked back at the local artist standing alone in the luminous desert in her pajamas, barefoot on cold dirt, watching the departure of something her world did not have vocabulary for. One final pulse of emotion through the fading connection. Not an image this time, not a concept. Just feeling, raw and unprocessed. Curiosity. and hope. Then it was inside, and the ramp was gone. Not retracted, simply absent, as though it had never been, and the craft was rising. It ascended vertically, accelerating from stationary to invisible in the space between one heartbeat and the next, swallowed by the upper atmosphere and the ancient stars with a speed that made the concept of velocity feel quaint and human and small. The glow died. The dome of light collapsed inward and vanished. The normal sounds of the desert returned in a rush, insects resuming their interrupted chorus, wind moving through the scrub brush with a dry whisper, the distant rumble of a truck on the highway proving that the world had continued to function during the interval when her portion of it had been borrowed. The local artist stood outside her trailer for a long time, bare feet on cold earth, arms wrapped around herself against the chill, eyes fixed on the empty sky where something impossible had been. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her pajama pants. The screen was alive again, responsive, displaying a time that made no sense. 3:19 a.m. 2 minutes. The entire encounter, the figure in her living room, the walk outside, the semicircle of beings, the young one's touch, the taller one's torrent of images, the departure, all of it compressed into 120 seconds of clock time. She had been outside for 20 minutes at minimum. She was certain of that. Her feet were numb from the cold ground. Her skin carried the fading tingle of the craft's luminous field. 20 minutes of subjective experience packed into 2 minutes of objective reality. She went back inside, locked the door, a gesture that felt absurd given what had just walked through it uninvited. She sat on her couch in the dark, and did not move until the sky outside her window began to lighten with the pale gray advance of dawn. She told no one. Rachel was populated with people who had alien encounter stories, tourists and locals alike who claimed to have seen craft, experienced contact, received messages from beings beyond the stars. The local artist had spent 3 years listening to those stories with the polite skepticism of someone who believed that loneliness and boredom and the vast empty canvas of the desert could make people see almost anything. She had no desire to become one of them. No desire to watch her experience reduced to a barroom anecdote, traded over beers with the same casual currency as fishing stories or tales of unlikely coincidence. But something had changed, and the change was not something she could undo by refusing to speak of it. The desert did not feel empty anymore. It felt watched. Not in a threatening way, not the surveillance of something hostile, not the scrutiny of something that intended harm. More like living inside a nature preserve where researchers observed from carefully maintained distance, documenting behaviors, cataloging patterns, recording the slow unfolding of a species that did not know it was being studied. The desert was a laboratory, and she was a specimen, and the walls of the enclosure were made of distance and silence and the vast indifference of the sky. She began watching the sky after that. Not obsessively, not with the desperate hunger of the true believers who drove hundreds of miles to Rachel in hopes of a sighting. Quietly, patiently, the way she watched the desert light change when she was preparing to paint, with attention rather than expectation, with openness rather than demand. And sometimes, on clear nights when the atmosphere was still and the stars burned with a hard, unwavering intensity that only true darkness can produce, she saw them. 3 lights in triangular formation, passing silently overhead, high enough to be mistaken for satellites, close enough to be recognized for what they were. Windows. Apertures in the skin of something vast and silent and profoundly patient, carrying observers who had been watching humanity since before humanity knew it was worth watching. She never photographed them, never reported them, never mentioned them to the tourists who passed through her gas station or the ranch hands who bought cigarettes and beer and occasionally asked if she'd seen anything strange lately. The lights were not hers to share. Some experiences exist beyond the jurisdiction of evidence, too intimate for proof, too strange for testimony, too real to require the validation of anyone who was not standing barefoot in the cold dirt when the sky opened and something ancient looked down and said, without words, without sound, in a language older than language itself, "We see you. We have always seen you. And we will not look away." By December of 2019, there were 37 documented reports of unusual phenomena along Highway 375 and the surrounding Area 51 buffer zone. This represented a nearly five-fold increase from the annual average of 8 reports recorded over the previous decade, a statistical anomaly significant enough to register even in a region where anomalies were considered part of the local climate. Most of the reports never reached the public. They were filed internally, through military channels with classification headers that ensured they would be read by fewer than a dozen people, through private security contractors whose incident logs were proprietary and legally sealed, through the handful of local law enforcement officers who had learned through experience when to document what they saw and when to keep their mouths shut and their pens capped. The official record remained clean. The unofficial record was beginning to buckle under its own weight. But some people talk. Long-haul drivers swap stories at rest stops and truck plazas, their voices low, their coffee growing cold, each man waiting for the other to laugh first so he can pretend he was joking. Security contractors change employers and carry their experiences with them like contraband packed between layers of legitimate cargo. Gas station attendants mention strange lights to customers, and those customers mention them to friends, and those friends mention them online, and the mentions accumulate until they form a texture. Not proof, not evidence, but a persistent background hum that something was happening in Nevada that could not be explained by weather balloons or swamp gas or experimental aircraft performing their classified maneuvers in the dead of night. By the end of the year, the hum had become difficult to ignore. The highway detective was one of the few people positioned to see the pattern forming. He worked for the State Department of Public Safety, assigned to the Highway Patrol Division covering Lincoln County, a jurisdiction that included Highway 375, the town of Rachel, and approximately 4,000 square miles of empty desert that generated very little crime and an enormous amount of driving. In 15 years on the job, he had dealt with vehicle accidents, narcotics runners using the remote highways as transit corridors, the occasional lost hiker who had underestimated the desert's capacity for indifference, and more intoxicated drivers than he could count or cared to remember. He was good at his work. Methodical, patient, the kind of investigator who trusted evidence the way a carpenter trusts a level, as the final arbiter of what was straight and what was crooked, regardless of what the eye wanted to believe. He had never dealt with UFOs. The concept did not occupy any space in his professional framework. Unidentified flying objects were entertainment, fodder for cable television documentaries and internet forums populated by people who needed mysteries the way some people needed religion. The detective dealt in facts, tire marks, blood alcohol levels, witness statements that could be cross-referenced and verified. He had no use for phenomena that could not be measured. But in December of 2019, 3 missing persons reports landed on his desk in the space of a single week. All 3 individuals had last been seen on or near Highway 375. All 3 had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no blood, no signs of violence, no logical explanation that fit the evidence. The first was a photographer from California. He had checked into the motel in Rachel on the 3rd of December, told the owner he intended to spend the night photographing the desert landscape, and never returned. His rental car was found the following morning on Highway 375, roughly 12 miles south of town. The driver's door stood open. The engine was still running, fuel gauge showing a quarter tank. His camera equipment sat undisturbed on the passenger seat, 2 professional bodies, 3 lenses, a tripod still in its case. No signs of struggle. No footprints leading away from the vehicle into the desert. No indication that the man had exited the car voluntarily or been removed from it by force. He had simply ceased to exist at some point between opening his door and whatever should have happened next. The second was a geology student from the State University in Las Vegas. She had been conducting field research on desert rock formations, sedimentary layers, mineral deposits, the kind of work that required camping alone in remote locations for days at a time. Her tent was found properly erected at her designated research site, sleeping bag unrolled inside, personal effects arranged with the organizational precision of someone who expected to return. Her truck was parked nearby, locked, keys on the front tire where field researchers habitually left them. The student was gone. Her last communication was a text message sent to her academic advisor at 11:47 p.m. Seeing strange lights to the north. Going to investigate. No further messages. No further contact of any kind. The third was a truck driver. Not the long-haul trucker from the earlier account, a different man, running a different route, but occupying the same stretch of highway on the same kind of night. His rig was found jackknifed across both lanes of Highway 375, the tractor angled sharply against the trailer in a configuration that suggested a sudden, violent stop. But the truly strange detail was the cargo container. It had been torn open from the inside. The reinforced steel walls peeled back like the skin of a fruit, bent outward by a force applied from within, as though something inside the container had decided to leave and had possessed the means to do so. No sign of the driver. No blood. No evidence of a collision or mechanical failure beyond the jackknifed position of the rig itself. 3 disappearances in 1 week on the same stretch of highway was statistically unusual. 3 disappearances with no bodies, no evidence, no forensic indicators, and no logical explanation was unprecedented in the detective's 15-year career. He had worked missing persons cases before: runaways, fugitives, hikers who had misjudged their water supply and been found days later as dehydrated remains in dry washes. Those cases had evidence. Those cases had narratives that could be reconstructed from physical data. These 3 cases had nothing. Just absence, clean, total, absolute, as though the desert had opened its mouth and swallowed 3 people without chewing. The detective drove out to each location. He measured distances. He photographed tire marks and footprints and the torn metal of the cargo container. He collected soil samples. He interviewed every local resident who might have seen something: the motel owner, the gas station attendant, the ranch hands, the handful of permanent Rachel residents who kept irregular hours and often found themselves awake and looking at the sky during the small hours of the morning. Nobody had seen anything concrete. But everybody had stories. Lights in the sky. Always 3. Always in triangular formation, always that same white-blue color that witnesses struggled to compare to anything in their existing visual vocabulary. Engines dying for no reason. Vehicles that ran perfectly before and after, but simply stopped functioning for intervals that lasted anywhere from seconds to minutes. Time gaps, periods where the clock on the dashboard showed a different duration than the subjective experience of the observer, minutes compressed into seconds or seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Figures standing by the roadside that vanished when approached. Tall, thin shapes visible in peripheral vision but absent when you turned to look directly at them, as though they existed in a frequency that direct attention could not access. The detective did not believe in aliens. He believed in evidence. But the evidence was not making sense, and the absence of evidence was making even less sense. 3 people do not vanish from a public highway without leaving something behind: a hair, a fiber, a skin cell, a footprint, a scuff mark, something that proves a physical body was present and then was not. These 3 had left nothing. Their departure from the physical world had been so clean that it bordered on the surgical. On December 18th, the detective made a decision that he would later struggle to explain to himself. The kind of decision that a rational man makes when rationality has failed to produce results and the only remaining option is empiricism. Direct observation. Go to the place where the impossible was reportedly happening and see for himself whether it happened or not. He would spend a night on Highway 375, just watching, just sitting in his patrol car at the location where the photographer's rental had been found, observing, documenting, waiting to see if anything unusual actually occurred or if the entire phenomenon was coincidence filtered through overactive imaginations and the natural human tendency to see patterns in randomness. He parked his patrol car at the precise coordinates where the rental vehicle had been recovered. He brought coffee, 2 thermoses, enough for 8 hours. A flashlight. His service weapon, holstered and loaded, because protocol required it, and because the desert at night was not a place to be unarmed regardless of what you believed about the things that moved through it. And a dashboard camera, set to continuous recording, its small lens pointed through the windshield at the empty road ahead. The detective settled in for a long night. The dashboard clock read 11:03 p.m. Nothing happened for the first 2 hours. The highway stretched into darkness in both directions, empty and featureless, its center line disappearing into the vanishing point like a demonstration of linear perspective. The occasional vehicle passed, headlights growing from pinpoints to full beams to receding taillights in the space of a minute, each one briefly proving that the world outside the detective's car still contained other people, then leaving him alone again with the silence and the coffee and the slow ticking of the dashboard clock. He drank coffee. He worked through paperwork on his laptop, using the time productively because he was, above all, a practical man. He periodically swept his flashlight across the desert on both sides of the highway. Scrub brush, rocks, the occasional reflective eyes of a small animal watching from a safe distance. Nothing unusual. Nothing that didn't belong. At 1:14 a.m., his radio produced a sound he had never heard before. Not the normal squelch of an open channel. That brief burst of static that preceded every transmission, as familiar to him as the sound of his own breathing. This was different. A rhythmic pulse, low and steady, with an almost biological quality. Not mechanical static, but something that rose and fell with the regularity of respiration. As though the radio were not malfunctioning, but breathing. The detective reached for the handset to adjust the frequency. His hand stopped halfway. There were lights in the sky. 3 of them. White-blue. Arranged in a perfect equilateral triangle. Hovering motionless against the stars perhaps 1,000 feet above the highway. Close enough to be unambiguously present. Far enough to deny the observer any structural detail beyond the lights themselves. "Here we go," the detective muttered, the words carrying no fear, only the grim satisfaction of a hypothesis being tested. He was here to see if something would happen. Something was happening. He pulled out his phone and activated the video camera. The screen showed the highway, the sky, the stars, and 3 points of light arranged in geometric formation. He pressed record. The screen flickered. Went black. The recording indicator vanished. The phone was dead, screen dark, unresponsive, as inert as a stone in his palm. Damn it! He set the phone aside and checked the dashboard camera. Its red indicator light blinked steadily, recording, still functional, its small lens capturing whatever was happening through the windshield. At least one device was still working. The lights began to descend. The detective's training asserted itself. Call it in, report unidentified aircraft in the airspace, follow protocol. He reached for his radio. The breathing static was all it would produce. That slow, rhythmic pulse that sounded less like interference and more like something listening. He tried his laptop, intending to send a message through the mobile data terminal that connected him to dispatch. The screen was frozen. The cursor had stopped mid-blink. The clock showed 1:14 a.m. and would not advance. "Okay," the detective said, his voice steady, his hands steady, everything steady because steadiness was the only tool he had left. "Okay. This is actually happening." The lights continued their descent. As they lowered, the detective's eyes resolved additional information from the darkness between the 3 points. The lights were not independent objects. They were components. Apertures set into the surface of something far larger. Windows, or ports, or orifices of some kind, built into the underside of a craft that was descending toward his position with the slow, deliberate patience of something that had nowhere else to be, and all the time in the universe to get there. The detective drew his service weapon. Standard protocol for unidentified aircraft in restricted airspace, though he was acutely aware, in the detached way that training permits even under extreme stress, that his sidearm was unlikely to be effective against something that could disable electronics from 100 feet away. He held the weapon in a two-handed grip, muzzle pointed at the windshield, finger indexed along the frame, and watched the craft settle lower. 50 feet. 30 feet. Close enough now that the detective could see the underside in detail. It was featureless, completely smooth, without seams, panels, rivets, exhaust ports, or any of the structural features that characterized human-built aircraft. The surface was dark, darker than the sky behind it, as though it were constructed from material that did not merely fail to reflect light but actively consumed it. Looking at it felt like looking at a hole in the visual field, a region where photons entered and did not return. The detective's door locks engaged. All 4, simultaneously, the mechanical thunk of the locking pins driving home, echoing through the cabin like a period at the end of a sentence. "Not good," the detective whispered. A beam appeared from the center of the craft's underside. It was not a spotlight. not a cone of illumination spreading outward from a source to a target. It was a column, a solid, vertical shaft of light extending from the craft to the road surface with perfectly defined edges, as though the light had been poured into an invisible cylinder. It did not illuminate the ground around it. It did not cast shadows. It simply existed as a geometric object made of luminance, occupying space the way a pillar occupies space, with presence and dimension and apparent solidity. A figure descended through the column. Tall, thin, large head, dark, reflective eyes. The detective had read enough witness statements in the past 2 weeks to recognize what he was seeing, even though every rational instinct he possessed was screaming that what he was seeing could not exist. He aimed his weapon at the figure through the windshield. Center mass. 15 yards. A shot he could make in his sleep. The figure raised one hand. Not in defense. Not in threat. In acknowledgement. The gesture of something that recognized the weapon, understood its function, and wished to communicate that it was unnecessary. And the detective felt something enter his mind. Peace. No weapon necessary. We are not here to harm. The presence was gentle but total. Not a whisper but a flood, filling every available space in his consciousness with a calm so profound that it felt architectural, as though tranquility were not an emotion but a room he had been led into, and the door closed softly behind him. His finger relaxed on the frame of the weapon. His arm lowered, not because he chose to lower it, but because the urgency that had raised it had been dissolved at the source, the way a headache dissolves when the underlying tension is released. The gun felt heavy and absurd in his hands, a relic of a threat model that no longer applied. More figures were descending through the light column. 5, 6. They spread outward in a circle around the patrol car, each one taking a position with the precision of a choreographed formation, each one standing motionless and watching the detective through the glass with those vast, dark, reflective eyes. The first figure, the tallest, the one whose hand had risen in that gesture of acknowledgement, approached the driver's side window. It stood inches from the glass and looked at the detective with an expression that his human pattern recognition could only interpret as interest. Clinical, measured, unhurried interest. Then the images came. Not his memories this time, theirs. He saw Earth from space. The slow rotation of the planet against the void, continents and oceans rendered in the blues and greens and whites of a world that did not know it was being observed. Then closer, North America resolving from the curvature, the Great Basin visible as a pale region of desert between mountain ranges, Nevada narrowing into focus, Highway 375 appearing as a faint line scratched across the landscape, the precise point where his patrol car sat becoming a dot of reflected starlight on an otherwise dark surface. And he saw the others. The photographer from California, standing beside his rental car in the darkness, head tilted back, face illuminated by the same white-blue glow, mouth open in an expression that might have been wonder or terror or both. The geology student, outside her tent, camera in hand, recording something the detective could not see from this perspective, her face lit by the light of a phenomenon she had walked toward voluntarily. The truck driver, behind the wheel of his rig, eyes wide, hands locked on the steering wheel, watching through his windshield as something approached from the darkness ahead. He saw them taken. Not violently. Not with force or restraint or any of the brutality that the word abduction implied. The light column surrounded each of them in turn, the same solid cylinder of luminance that now extended from the craft above the detective's car, and they rose through it, their bodies lifting from the ground with a gentleness that suggested the light was not pulling them but carrying them, the way water carries a leaf. The figures guided them, long hands extended, not gripping, just directing, the way a host guides a guest through an unfamiliar hallway. He saw the interior of the craft. Rooms that were impossibly large, their dimensions exceeding what the external geometry of the vessel could contain, as though the interior existed in a different spatial framework than the exterior. Walls that curved organically, their surfaces textured like living tissue, rising and falling with a slow, rhythmic motion that the detective's mind could only process as breathing. Equipment that defied categorization, devices that appeared simultaneously technological and biological, metallic surfaces interwoven with structures that resembled vascular networks, machines that might have been grown rather than built. He saw the photographer lying on a curved surface, eyes open, body still, while one of the figures passed a device over him that emitted no light and left no marks, scanning, recording, cataloging the physical architecture of a human body with the thoroughness of a medical imaging suite compressed into a handheld instrument. He saw the geology student in a different room, seated in something that served as a chair, answering questions that were never spoken aloud, her lips not moving, but her mind engaged in a dialogue conducted entirely through the same telepathic medium that was now projecting these images into the detective's consciousness. He saw the truck driver being returned to his vehicle, lowered through the light column, placed gently in his seat, his hands arranged on the steering wheel, his mind clouded with the careful fog of induced amnesia. We study. We learn. We do not keep. The images shifted. The detective saw other encounters, other examinations, hundreds of them, thousands, stretching backward through decades, perhaps centuries, perhaps longer. An archive of contact compiled with the patience of something that measured its existence not in years but in geological epochs. And he saw what happened to those who were studied. They were returned. Always. Sometimes minutes after being taken, sometimes hours, but always alive, always physically unharmed, carrying nothing but confusion and fragmented memories and the vague sense that time had misbehaved in their presence. Except for the three. The three recent disappearances were different, and the images that conveyed their fate carried an emotional undertone the detective had not felt from the presence before: distress. Something had gone wrong with the process. The memory modifications, the careful, precise alterations that normally smoothed over the experience and returned the subject to their life with nothing more than a vague sense of unease, had not functioned correctly. The three subjects had retained full conscious awareness throughout the examination. They had seen everything, remembered everything, and they had fought, struggling against the paralysis, screaming into the telepathic silence, their terror so acute that it had disrupted the examination protocols and forced the figures to make a decision they were not prepared for. They had kept them, not out of malice, not out of any desire to imprison or punish, out of concern. The figures did not know what to do with humans who remembered everything, did not know if it was safe to return them to a world that was not ready to process what they had experienced. They had been held in a state of suspended comfort, conscious, cared for, unharmed, while the figures deliberated, consulting whatever decision-making architecture governed their operations, trying to determine the appropriate course of action. A mistake. We are sorry. They are well. They are safe. They wish to return. The connection broke. The detective gasped, a raw, involuntary sound torn from lungs that had forgotten to breathe, and his vision swam, the world fragmenting into smeared light and shadow before slowly resolving back into coherence. When he could focus again, three figures stood in a line in front of his patrol car, illuminated by his headlights. Human figures. The photographer from California. The geology student. The truck driver. Standing on the asphalt in the clothes they had been wearing when they disappeared, looking pale and disoriented and profoundly confused, but alive. Unmistakably, undeniably alive. The light column retracted into the craft above. The tall figures ascended, rising through the air without the column's assistance this time, simply lifting from the ground and returning to the vessel with the effortless verticality of smoke rising from an extinguished candle. The circular windows dimmed. The craft rose, silent, accelerating, impossible, and was gone, absorbed into the stars with a velocity that made the eye doubt it had ever been present. The detective's door locks disengaged. His radio crackled back to standard transmission, dispatch frequency, clear signal, no breathing static. His laptop unfroze, the cursor blinking normally, the clock advancing to 1:19 a.m. 5 minutes since the lights had first appeared. The three stood by the roadside, blinking in the headlights, their shadows stretching long behind them on the empty highway. The detective got out of his vehicle on legs that felt provisional, as though they might stop cooperating at any moment, as though the paralysis might return and leave him standing in the middle of the road, frozen, while the world continued without him. He walked toward them. The photographer looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and could not yet begin to process any of it. His voice, when he spoke, was barely audible, a whisper pressed flat by the weight of everything behind it. They let us go. They said it was a mistake. They said they were sorry. The geology student was crying without sound, tears tracking down her face in steady, unbroken lines, her body completely still, as though the crying were happening to her rather than being produced by her. She did not wipe the tears. She did not acknowledge them. She simply stood there and let them fall. The truck driver stared at the sky, not at the detective, not at the others, not at the ground or the highway or any of the terrestrial surfaces that constituted the world he had been returned to. He stared upward, his face tilted toward the stars, his expression carrying the terrible calm of someone who has seen the scaffolding behind reality and can never again believe the stage is real. "They're always watching," he said. His voice was flat, declarative, the voice of someone stating a physical law rather than an opinion. "Always. We never noticed, but they're always there." The detective guided them to his patrol car. He radioed for backup. He called for medical assistance. When dispatch asked what had happened, the standard question, requiring a standard answer that could be entered into a standard database field, the detective said that he had located the 3 missing subjects wandering on Highway 375, apparently suffering from dehydration and exposure following an extended period in the desert without adequate supplies. The 3 confirmed this story when questioned. Dehydration, disorientation, lost in the desert. The narrative was plausible, and it was simple, and it fit neatly into the categories that the system was designed to accommodate. Nobody mentioned lights in the sky. Nobody mentioned beings or craft or telepathic contact or the gentle, clinical curiosity of something that had been studying humanity since before the first city was built. The official record received a clean entry, and the unofficial truth went where unofficial truths always go, into the silence between what happened and what can be proven. The detective reviewed his dashboard camera footage the next morning. He watched it twice, then a third time, looking for anything, a light, a shadow, a distortion, any visual artifact that confirmed what he had experienced. The footage showed his patrol car sitting empty on the highway for 5 minutes. No lights descending from the sky. No craft hovering above the vehicle. No figures standing on the road. No beam of solid light extending from above. No 3 missing persons materializing from thin air. Just static hiss and darkness and the detective's empty seat, as though the camera had recorded a different version of reality. The version where nothing happened, where the highway remained empty, where the sky held nothing but stars. The camera had captured nothing. But the detective knew what he had seen, what he had felt, the presence in his mind, the images, the apology delivered in a language that predated every human tongue. And when he looked up at the stars that night from the parking lot of his precinct office, he understood something that could not be filed in any database or entered into any report or proved by any instrument his species had yet devised. Humanity was not alone, had never been alone, would never be alone. The watchers were patient. The watchers were careful. And the watchers would continue their work long after every witness who had seen them had returned to the dust from which the watchers had first observed them rising. Some truths are too large for evidence. They can only be carried, silently, heavily, alone, by those who have stood close enough to see them and survived the seeing. There is something about desert photography that draws a certain type of person. Not the social media crowd-chasing golden hour selfies at photogenic overlooks, the other kind. The ones who drive 12 hours without complaint to capture rock formations nobody has ever heard of. The ones who understand that the most extraordinary light occurs at 4 in the morning, when the rest of the species is unconscious and the landscape belongs entirely to whoever had the discipline to set an alarm and the stubbornness to honor it. The landscape photographer was that type of person. She had been doing this work for 8 years, selling prints through her website, teaching workshops twice a year, earning just enough to sustain the life that allowed her to keep doing what she loved. Her specialty was night photography. Long exposures that transformed the slow rotation of the Earth into luminous arcs across the sky. Star trails rendered as brushstrokes on a canvas of darkness. Images that revealed the desert the way most people never saw it. Not as emptiness but as a theater of light so subtle that only patience and a tripod could capture it. In November of 2019, the landscape photographer was working on a series she had titled Empty Spaces. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Photograph the most isolated locations in the American Southwest. Places where you could stand at the center and turn 360 degrees without seeing a single artifact of human civilization. No buildings, no roads, no power lines, no light except what the stars provided. Pure negative space. The absence of clutter rendered as art. Nevada's extraterrestrial highway was perfect for the project. She had studied the maps. Highway 375 cut through some of the emptiest terrain on the continent, miles of scrubland and alkali flats with almost no development beyond the tiny settlement of Rachel and a few scattered ranching operations. The proximity to Area 51 meant even fewer structures than the landscape would otherwise support. The government had acquired most of the surrounding acreage decades earlier, ensuring that the buffer zone remained as undeveloped as the day the desert had formed it. Perfect isolation. Perfect darkness. Perfect conditions for the kind of photography that required the complete absence of everything except geology and starlight. She had driven out from Flagstaff with her traveling companion, a friend from her university years, the kind of platonic bond that endured because neither party placed demands on the other beyond occasional conversation and a willingness to split fuel costs on long drives. He was not a photographer, but he was comfortable with silence, unbothered by cold, and genuinely content to sit in a folding chair in the middle of nowhere for hours while the landscape photographer did her work. These were rarer qualities than most people realized. They reached Highway 375 just after sunset on November 9th. The landscape photographer had selected a spot roughly 15 miles south of Rachel, where the highway bisected a flat expanse of desert with mountains visible as dark silhouettes against the horizon in every direction. No trees. No buildings. No light pollution. Just the enormous sky and the ancient ground beneath it, exactly as she had envisioned. "This is it," she said, pulling her vehicle onto the gravel shoulder. "This is perfect." Her companion surveyed the darkness through the passenger window. "You sure? It's pretty empty." "That's the point. Empty is what we want. No ambient light, no visual noise. Just stars and landscape." They set up 50 yards from the highway. The landscape photographer had refined her process over hundreds of shoots into a sequence as precise as a surgical checklist. Tripod first, legs spread, spirit level checked, locked into position on ground firm enough to resist wind vibration. Camera next, mounted to the tripod head, lens pointed at the composition she had pre-visualized during the drive. Then the intervalometer, the small electronic device that would trigger the shutter automatically every 30 seconds for the next 3 hours, building a library of frames that would later be stacked into a single image showing the rotation of the heavens as luminous curves against the stationary Earth. While she worked, her companion spread a blanket on the desert floor and assembled the folding chairs they had brought. The temperature was dropping with the aggressive haste that characterized November nights in the Great Basin, the ground surrendering its stored heat to the atmosphere as though eager to be rid of it, the air cooling from tolerable to bitter in the space of an hour. The landscape photographer pulled on her jacket, checked her camera settings one final time, and pressed the button on her intervalometer. The shutter clicked. 30 seconds of silence. Click. 30 seconds. Click. The rhythm established itself, mechanical, reliable, the metronome of a process she had performed 1,000 times. She walked back to the chairs. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. This was her favorite element of night photography. Not the images themselves, not the processing or the printing or the satisfaction of a composition that worked, but this. Sitting in the dark while the camera did its patient work. The rhythm of the shutter. The cold air carrying the mineral scent of ancient earth. The sense of being very small beneath something very large, and finding peace in the disproportion rather than anxiety. "You ever think about how weird this is?" her companion said after a while. "What? Sitting in the desert at night?" "No, I mean, we're here because you want to photograph nothing. Literally nothing. Empty desert. Empty sky." She smiled. "It's not nothing. It's negative space. The absence of clutter. That's actually harder to photograph than you'd think. Most people's instinct is to fill the frame. Leaving it empty requires discipline. If you say so. He pulled his jacket tighter against the cold. How long are we out here? 3 hours for the star trails. Then we head back to Rachel, sleep, and do it again tomorrow from a different position. 3 hours of sitting in the freezing desert. Living the dream. You didn't have to come. Yeah, but your road trip playlists are excellent, and that place in Rachel has surprisingly good burgers. They lapsed back into the quiet. The camera shutter clicked its steady cadence in the background. Click. 30 seconds. Click. 30 seconds. Click. The landscape photographer checked her watch. 9:47 p.m. They had been in position for approximately 40 minutes. The first batch of frames would be strong. She could feel it the way a painter feels a canvas coming together before the final brushstrokes land. The Milky Way was visible as a luminous band across the southern sky, and the atmosphere was cloudless from horizon to horizon. That was when her companion pointed at the eastern skyline. Hey, what's that? She looked where he was indicating. At first she saw nothing unusual, just the dark serration of distant mountains against the marginally less dark sky. Then she noticed the light. Small, faint, barely distinguishable from the stars, except that it occupied a position below the horizon line where stars did not belong. A steady glow, white with a subtle blue undertone, sitting motionless on the boundary between earth and sky. Probably someone camping, she said. Or a ranch. Out there. There's nothing out there. We checked the maps, remember? No roads, no buildings, nothing for 20 miles in that direction. She frowned. He was right. They had selected this location specifically because of its comprehensive isolation. There should be no light sources visible at any bearing. Could be a plane, she offered. Planes move. That's not moving. They watched the light for several minutes. It remained absolutely stationary, a fixed point of white-blue luminance on the eastern horizon, unwavering, unblinking. And as the landscape photographer's eyes adjusted more fully to the darkness, she began to notice something anomalous about its geometry. The light was not round. It was not a single point. It had structure, 3 distinct vertices arranged in a formation that her visual cortex, trained by 8 years of compositional analysis, recognized immediately. A perfect equilateral triangle. Okay, that's strange, she admitted. She walked to her camera and looked through the viewfinder, reorienting the lens toward the eastern horizon. Through the magnification of her telephoto, the triangle resolved with greater precision. 3 points of light, white-blue, intense, self-contained, connected by something darker. A structure. A shape. Not random atmospheric scatter or distant vehicle lights. A deliberate geometric formation suspended above the desert floor. You getting this? Her companion had followed her to the tripod. Yeah, hold on. She halted her intervalometer sequence and reframed the composition to include the triangle. She took several exposures at varying shutter speeds, fast enough to freeze the lights as sharp points, slow enough to reveal any motion blur that would indicate drift or rotation. What do you think it is? I don't know. Could be military. We're close to the restricted perimeter. Military aircraft don't hover in place. Maybe it's a drone. Or a helicopter at distance. Do you hear rotor noise? She listened. The desert was silent. Profoundly, completely silent. Not even wind. No engine harmonics, no blade chop, no atmospheric displacement of any kind. Just the vast empty quiet of a landscape that contained nothing mechanical except her camera and her car. Okay. Yeah, that is genuinely strange, she conceded. They watched the triangle for another 10 minutes. It did not move. It did not fluctuate in brightness. It did not do anything except exist. 3 perfect points of light against the dark, as fixed and deliberate as surveyor's marks on a construction site. I'm going to get closer, her companion said abruptly. What? No. We don't know what that is. Exactly. So I'm going to find out. He started walking toward the eastern horizon, toward the triangle. Come on, that could be military. You could be arrested. You could be shot. I'll be fine. It's just a light. He kept walking. The landscape photographer grabbed her camera from the tripod and followed him, partially because she did not want him approaching an unknown phenomenon alone, and partially because she was curious. The light was strange, geometric, unlike anything in her extensive catalog of desert night phenomena. 8 years of photographing darkness, and she had never seen anything like this. They walked across the desert floor, flashlights off to preserve their adapted night vision. Scrub brush crunched beneath their boots. The air was cold and still and tasted of alkaline dust. The landscape photographer kept her eyes on the triangle as they walked. It remained exactly where it had been, 3 points of light on the horizon, steady and unwavering. They walked for what felt like 10 minutes, then 15. The highway behind them receded into a faint line. The triangle ahead of them looked exactly the same. Is it just me, her companion said, or are we not getting any closer? The landscape photographer stopped and studied the formation. He was right. They had been walking at a steady pace toward a fixed point on the horizon for at least 15 minutes. They should be noticeably closer. The apparent size of the triangle should have increased. The lights should be brighter, more resolved. But the triangle looked identical to how it had appeared from the highway. Same size, same brightness, same position relative to the horizon line. That doesn't make sense. She pulled out her phone and opened the compass application. The triangle bore due east. We're walking in a straight line directly toward it. The geometry is simple. We should be closing distance. Maybe it's farther away than we estimated. Could be on the far side of those mountains. Then we'd see it rising relative to the horizon as we approached. It would appear higher in the sky. The elevation hasn't changed at all. They continued walking. The landscape photographer counted paces in her head, a field technique for estimating distance when GPS was unavailable or untrustworthy. 500 steps. 1,000. 1,500. Each step should have subtracted roughly a yard from the distance between them and the lights. 1,500 yards of closure. Nearly a mile. The triangle should be dramatically closer. It was not. It looked exactly the same. Precisely, measurably, impossibly the same. This is impossible, her companion said, and his voice had lost its casual confidence. We've walked at least a mile. We should be way closer by now. The landscape photographer looked back toward the highway. Their vehicle was a small, dark shape in the distance, barely visible, clearly far away. They had covered significant ground. That was empirically verifiable. But the triangle ahead of them had not changed by a single degree of arc or a single lumen of brightness. It's maintaining constant distance, she said, hearing the words and recognizing their absurdity as they left her mouth. The closer we get, the farther away it moves. Or seems to move. Or something. That's not how light works. I know. Her companion stopped walking and raised his phone. I'm taking a picture. He aimed the device at the triangle and captured an image. Then he looked at the screen and his expression changed. That's weird. What? He turned the phone toward her. The image showed the desert floor, the sky, the mountain silhouettes against the stars, but no triangle. Where the 3 points of light should have been, where they were clearly and unambiguously visible to their naked eyes at that very moment, there was only empty darkness. Try again, she said. He took another photo. Same result. Desert. Sky. Mountains. No triangle. The landscape photographer raised her own camera, her professional instrument, a device she trusted the way a surgeon trusts a scalpel, and took a test exposure. She checked the preview screen. Nothing. Just the desert and the stars and the dark line of the mountains. No triangle. No lights. No indication that anything occupied the portion of sky where 3 geometric points of white-blue luminance were. at that very moment, clearly visible to her unaided eyes. "This doesn't make sense," she said, and she heard the first edge of something that was not confusion but was adjacent to it. A quality of cognitive distress that occurred when the instruments you relied upon contradicted the evidence of your own senses. "We can see it. It's right there. Why isn't it registering on camera? Maybe it's a frequency thing. Like it's emitting light in a spectrum our eyes can detect but cameras can't. That's not how the visible spectrum works. If our retinas can detect it, CCD sensors can detect it. The sensitivity ranges overlap almost completely." She adjusted her camera settings, longer exposure, higher ISO, wider aperture, every parameter pushed toward maximum light sensitivity. She took another frame. Empty sky. She switched to manual focus and aimed the lens directly at the center of the triangle, placing the focus point precisely where the formation hung in her visual field. Another exposure. Nothing. Stars and darkness and the absolute absence of anything unusual. "This is impossible," she muttered. The word felt insufficient. Impossible was supposed to mean cannot happen. But it was happening. She could see the triangle with her naked eyes, 3 sharp, bright, geometrically perfect points of light, and her camera, her professional-grade camera with its full-frame sensor and its precision optics, insisted there was nothing there. "Should we keep going?" her companion asked. She looked at the triangle. It hung on the horizon with the serene indifference of something that would be there whether she observed it or not. "No," she said. "Let's head back." "You sure?" "Yeah. Something about this doesn't feel right. And if we can't photograph it, there's no professional reason to be out here chasing it." They turned and walked back toward the highway. The landscape photographer kept glancing over her shoulder at the triangle. It maintained its position behind them, same size, same brightness, same impossible fixity. The walk back felt shorter than the walk out, a perceptual compression she attributed to familiarity with the terrain rather than any further anomaly. Perhaps 15 minutes before they reached their setup. The camera on the tripod was still clicking faithfully. Every 30 seconds, the shutter firing, the intervalometer performing its mechanical duty with the indifferent reliability of a device that did not know or care what it was photographing. She looked back at the triangle one final time. Still there. Same size. Same brightness. Same distance. Her companion said what she was already thinking. "Here's the really strange part. We walked toward it for 20 minutes and it didn't get closer. But we've been walking away from it for 15 minutes, and it hasn't gotten farther away either." He was right. The triangle should appear smaller now, more distant, subtended across fewer degrees of arc. But it looked identical to how it had appeared when they first noticed it from the highway. The same size from every distance. As though it existed outside the normal relationship between proximity and apparent magnitude. As though distance itself did not apply to it. "This is genuinely starting to unnerve me," she admitted. "Should we pack up and leave?" "No. I want to see what the time-lapse captured. Maybe the camera recorded something in the long exposures that we didn't notice in real time." They returned to their chairs, but the comfortable silence from earlier had been replaced by something watchful, a shared alertness that kept both of them glancing toward the eastern horizon. The landscape photographer monitored the triangle. Her companion checked his phone repeatedly, though there was no cellular signal in this part of the basin. The camera continued its metronome. Click, 30 seconds, click. At 11:23 p.m., the triangle began to change. Not moving. Not growing or shrinking. But the 3 points of light initiated a slow clockwise rotation, each vertex maintaining its position relative to the other two while the entire formation turned on its central axis like a wheel viewed from directly ahead. "Are you seeing this?" her companion whispered. "Yeah." She was already moving toward her camera. She halted the time-lapse sequence and switched to video mode. Pressed record. Through the viewfinder, she saw the desert and the sky and the mountains. No triangle. The camera's sensor continued to deny what her eyes confirmed without ambiguity. "Still not registering," she said flatly. The triangle rotated faster, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The 3 points traced overlapping circles in the sky, each light scribing its own arc while the formation maintained its geometric integrity. Then they separated. The 3 points broke formation and began moving independently, one ascending, one drifting left, one drifting right. They spread across the horizon, each light traveling in a different direction, the triangular shape dissolving into 3 individual points of luminance separated by what appeared to be miles of empty sky. "What the hell?" her companion breathed. The points continued their divergence until they occupied positions so far apart that the landscape photographer had to turn her head to see all 3. 3 solitary lights hanging in the darkness at extreme distances from one another, each one as bright and steady as it had been when they were clustered together. Then they returned. Fast. So fast that the landscape photographer almost missed the transition. One instant the lights were scattered across the full width of the eastern horizon. The next instant they had snapped back into triangular formation, the same perfect equilateral geometry, the same spacing, the same orientation. As though the separation had been an illusion, or a demonstration, or a test. The triangle held its reassembled shape for perhaps 5 seconds. Then it vanished. Not gradually. Not by fading or receding or ascending beyond the threshold of visibility. It simply ceased, the 3 points of light switching from full brightness to absolute absence in a single frame, as though someone had found the circuit breaker that powered the phenomenon and thrown it to the off position. One moment, 3 points of light. The next moment, empty sky. No transition. No afterimage. Nothing. The landscape photographer and her companion sat in the folding chairs in stunned silence, staring at the portion of sky that had contained the impossible and now contained only stars. "Did that just happen?" he finally asked. Yes, that happened." "What was it?" "I have no idea." She checked her camera's video file. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of footage. She played it back on the camera's rear display. Desert, sky, mountains, stars. No triangle, no lights, no separation, no recombination, no vanishing. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of absolutely nothing. "This isn't possible," she said, and her voice had acquired a quality she did not recognize. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of exhausted bewilderment, the cognitive equivalent of a muscle that has been pushed beyond its capacity and is beginning to fail. The camera should have recorded something. Even if it couldn't resolve the triangle clearly, there should be a light anomaly, an artifact, a variation in the exposure values. Something that indicates a light source existed in that region of the sky. Maybe it's like you said before, different spectrum. Something outside the sensor's range. That still doesn't account for it. Our eyes and camera sensors respond to nearly identical wavelength ranges. If photons are reaching our retinas, they should be reaching the sensor. The physics doesn't support selective invisibility. She sat down heavily. Her hands were trembling, a fine, involuntary oscillation that had nothing to do with the cold. 8 years of photographing the desert at night. Thousands of hours in darkness. She had never encountered a phenomenon that her equipment refused to acknowledge. "Should we report this?" her companion asked. "Report what?" "We have no evidence. 3 cameras, my DSLR, your phone, and my intervalometer running for 3 hours, and not a single frame shows anything. Without photos, without video, it's just a story. 2 people in the desert claiming they saw lights. People will think we were hallucinating or making it up for attention." "What about the time-lapse? The one that's been running this whole time?" She had forgotten. The intervalometer had been firing continuously since 9:07 p.m., every 30 seconds, an exposure, building a sequence of frames that would later be composited into star trail images. 3 hours of data. 360 individual frames. She walked to the tripod, stopped the sequence, and extracted the memory card. Her laptop glowed in the darkness as the files loaded. She opened the first image, the desert at night, stars rendered as points, the beginning of the trails that would elongate across subsequent frames. She jumped ahead. Frame 10. Frame 20. Frame 50. Frame 100. Nothing unusual in any of them. Beautiful compositions. Exactly what she had come to Nevada to capture. But no triangle, no lights, no anomaly of any kind. She navigated to the frames captured during the period when the triangle had been visible, rotating, separating, and vanishing. She examined each one individually, expanding the preview to full resolution, scrutinizing every pixel in the region of sky where the phenomenon had occurred. Empty. Every frame. Just stars and darkness. "It's not there," she said quietly. 3 hours of continuous photography and the triangle doesn't appear in a single frame. Her companion looked over her shoulder at the screen. "That's impossible. It was right there. For over an hour. It should be in dozens of these images." She kept scrolling. The star trails were flawless, long, curved arcs recording the Earth's rotation with the precision of an astronomical instrument. But where the triangle had been, where 3 points of light had rotated and separated and snapped back together and disappeared, there was only the uniform darkness of empty sky. "I don't understand," she said. "Light is light. Cameras record light. We saw light. The camera should have recorded it." She checked the file metadata, exposure duration, ISO sensitivity, aperture setting, timestamp. Everything was normal. No corruption. No processing errors. The files were technically perfect. They simply did not contain what she had seen. They packed up their equipment without speaking. The easy rapport from earlier in the evening had been replaced by an uneasy awareness that something profoundly strange had occurred, and they possessed no mechanism to prove it, explain it, or file it into any existing category of experience. The landscape photographer loaded her gear into the vehicle, while her companion folded the chairs and blanket. There was nothing to say. They had both witnessed something impossible, and the instruments of documentation, the cameras, the sensors, the devices designed to create objective records of observable reality, unanimously insisted it had not happened. They drove back to Rachel in silence. The motel was fully booked. Enthusiasts had reserved rooms weeks in advance, so they had arranged spots at the small RV park behind the establishment. The landscape photographer's vehicle had a sleeping platform built into the cargo area, and her companion had a tent. It was past midnight when they arrived. The bar was still open. Through the thin walls, the landscape photographer could hear tourists drinking and trading UFO stories. Lights in the sky, missing time, strange aircraft, the familiar mythology of this place delivered in voices made bold by alcohol and the safety of an audience that wanted to believe. Normally, she found these stories entertaining in a detached, anthropological way. People so hungry for mystery that they would see spacecraft in airplane contrails and cosmic significance in weather balloons. But tonight, it was not entertaining. Tonight, she had seen something too, something she could not explain, could not photograph, could not prove. And unlike the tourists in the bar, she carried the uncomfortable certainty that what she had seen was real. Not a misidentification. Not a hallucination. Not a story embellished for an audience. Real, in the way that gravity is real, in the way that the ground beneath your feet is real, experienced with full sensory clarity by 2 independent observers whose instruments unanimously denied it. She did not sleep well. The evening replayed behind her closed eyes in an endless loop, the triangle on the horizon, the walk that closed no distance, the lights separating and recombining, the total absence of photographic evidence. Around 3 in the morning, she abandoned the effort and opened her laptop. She reviewed the time-lapse images again, frame by frame, adjusting brightness, pushing exposure, pulling shadow detail, looking for any trace, any hint of anomalous light, any pixel-level variation that might indicate a source existed where her eyes had seen one. Nothing. She cranked the brightness to absurd levels, blowing the images into grainy, overexposed noise. Still nothing where the triangle had been. She adjusted levels, curves, color channels. She examined the files with the forensic thoroughness of someone who needed to find something and was beginning to understand that the nothing she kept finding was the something. Frustrated, she closed the laptop and stared through the vehicle's window at the dark desert. The bar had closed. The parking lot was silent. Just her and her companion and a dozen other visitors sleeping in their vehicles and tents, all of them drawn to this remote settlement by its proximity to government secrets and the legends that grew in the soil around them. She picked up her phone and did something she had been resisting since they had returned. She searched Triangle Lights Nevada Desert. The results were extensive. Dozens of reports. Hundreds. People describing triangular light formations near Area 51, some accounts matching what she had seen with unsettling precision. 3 points of light in perfect geometric formation. No sound. Appearing and disappearing without transition. Several reports specifically described cameras failing to capture the phenomenon. Others mentioned the distance anomaly, lights that maintained constant apparent size regardless of the observer's movement toward or away from them. She found a forum thread from 2017 where a poster described walking toward triangular lights for 30 minutes without getting closer. A 2018 account mentioned cameras returning blank frames despite the phenomenon being clearly visible. A researcher's discussion thread debated why UFO photographs were almost universally blurry or inconclusive. The prevailing hypothesis involved electromagnetic interference with camera sensors. The landscape photographer frowned. Electromagnetic interference might cause static, noise, distortion, artifacts that indicated something was affecting the sensor. But it would not produce clean, technically perfect images that simply omitted the phenomenon. Her files were not corrupted. They were not distorted. They were immaculate and empty. She searched further. Light wavelengths invisible to cameras but visible to human eyes. The answer was straightforward and unhelpful. No such wavelengths existed within the visible spectrum. The range of electromagnetic radiation detectable by the human retina, roughly 380 to 700 nanometers, fell entirely within the sensitivity range of modern camera sensors. If light fell within that band, both biological and electronic receivers should detect it. There was no theoretical basis for selective invisibility. At 4:30 a.m., she finally slept, laptop still open, phone still displaying search results, her mind still circling the same unanswerable question like water around a drain that would not let it through. She woke to knocking on her window. Her companion's face peered in through the glass, breath fogging against it. "You alive in there?" She unlocked the door and pushed it open. Her neck ached from sleeping at an angle the human spine had not been engineered to sustain. "What time is it?" "Almost 10. I figured you'd want to sleep in, but I'm starving." "Breakfast." They walked into the restaurant. The walls were covered with alien-themed decorations, newspaper clippings about sightings, photographs of strange lights, handwritten testimonials from visitors who claimed contact with beings from beyond the atmosphere. The landscape photographer found herself studying these artifacts with an attention she had never afforded them before. Were any of them real? Had those people, those strangers whose names were pinned to the wall alongside blurry photographs and breathless accounts, seen something like what she had seen? Over eggs and coffee, her companion asked the question she had been dreading. "So, what do we do about last night? What can we do? We don't have evidence. We could tell someone what we saw." "Who? The Air Force? The sheriff? They'd laugh at us." "What about posting it online? There are communities, forums, groups, people who share this kind of experience." She shook her head. "I'm not posting about seeing a UFO. Do you understand what that would do to my professional credibility? I teach workshops. I sell prints. If I start claiming I saw aliens in Nevada, people will think I'm manufacturing publicity or having a breakdown." "But you did see something." "I know, but I can't prove it. And without proof, it's just a story." They ate in silence. The landscape photographer pushed her eggs around her plate without appetite. "Are you going out again tonight?" her companion asked eventually. "I don't know. Part of me wants to see if it happens again. Part of me wants to pack up and drive home and pretend the whole thing was a dream. I vote for trying again. For science. She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. This isn't science. This is the opposite of science. Science requires evidence. Then let's get evidence. We go back tonight. Same spot. But this time we set up multiple cameras. Different systems, different angles, different technologies. If the triangle appears and every camera fails simultaneously, that tells us something. Not what it is, but at least that the phenomenon is real and has measurable effects on recording equipment. She considered this. He had a point. If they replicated the conditions and the same result occurred, cameras refusing to capture what their eyes could clearly see, that would constitute a data point. Not proof of the triangle, but proof of the camera failure. Proof that something was interfering with electronic sensors in a consistent, repeatable way. Okay, she said. We try again tonight. But if the same thing happens, if the cameras don't work, we pack up and leave. No third night. Deal. Deal. They spent the afternoon preparing. The landscape photographer had 2 camera bodies, her primary DSLR and a backup mirrorless. Both professional-grade instruments. Both tested exhaustively over thousands of shoots. She ran diagnostics on each, taking photographs around the town, checking the files, verifying that every system was functioning within specifications. Everything worked perfectly. Her companion borrowed an action camera from one of the tourists staying at the RV park, promising to return it the following day. They tested that as well. Normal operation. No anomalies. At 8 p.m., they drove back to the same location. The landscape photographer wanted to replicate every variable. Same coordinates, same time, same equipment arrangement. If the triangle appeared, she intended to be ready. She set up 3 cameras this time. The DSLR on a tripod running the intervalometer for time-lapse photography. The mirrorless on a second tripod aimed directly at the portion of the eastern horizon where the triangle had appeared the previous night, set to continuous shooting mode, 1 frame every 2 seconds. And the action camera mounted on a ground stake, positioned for continuous video recording with its wide-angle lens capturing nearly 170 degrees of sky. Okay, she said, checking her settings for the final time. We're ready. They sat and waited. 9 p.m. came and went. The eastern horizon remained dark. 9:30. Nothing. At 10, her companion said. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Maybe. She tried to determine whether she felt disappointed or relieved. Part of her wanted to see the triangle again. Needed to see it. Needed the confirmation that the previous night had actually happened, that she had not constructed an elaborate hallucination from fatigue and the power of suggestion. But another part was prepared to accept its absence, to return to the world of normal photography where cameras recorded what existed and the sky contained only stars. 10:30. The desert was quiet. The Milky Way arced overhead in its ancient, indifferent grandeur. The mountains were dark silhouettes. No triangle. At 10:47 p.m., her companion pointed at the eastern horizon. There. Her heart seized. He was right. The triangle was back, 3 points of white-blue light in perfect equilateral formation, occupying the exact same position on the horizon as the previous night. As though it had an assigned location. As though it lived there. Cameras, she said, already on her feet. She checked all 3 systems. The DSLR's time-lapse was running, the intervalometer firing faithfully every 30 seconds. The mirrorless was capturing continuous frames. The action camera's recording indicator glowed red. All 3 instruments were aimed at the triangle. All 3 were operational. She looked through the DSLR's viewfinder. Empty sky. No triangle visible in the frame. She checked the mirrorless preview screen. Same result. Desert and stars, the horizon rendered in perfect detail, but no lights where the formation was clearly, unmistakably visible to her naked eyes. The action camera's small display was difficult to read in the darkness, but she could discern enough to confirm that it, too, showed nothing where the triangle should be. "Same as last night," she said. "We can see it. The cameras can't. That is genuinely impossible." "I know." The triangle began to rotate. Slow clockwise spin, identical to the previous night's behavior. The three vertices maintaining their geometric relationship while the entire formation turned on its invisible axis. She watched it through her eyes, then through the viewfinder. Nothing. The camera's sensor denied the phenomenon with the same calm, comprehensive blankness as before. The triangle rotated for approximately 5 minutes. Then, as it had the night before, the 3 points separated, spreading across the horizon, each light traveling independently, creating a wide arc of white-blue luminance against the dark. Then they snapped back together, reforming the triangle with that same instantaneous precision. And then something different happened. The triangle started moving toward them. Not fast. Not with the sudden aggression of something attacking. Slow. Deliberate. A controlled approach that communicated intention without revealing its nature. But definitely, unmistakably closing the distance. The 3 points growing brighter, the formation growing larger, the gap between the phenomenon and the observers shrinking for the first time in 2 nights of watching. "Ah." Her companion's voice had gone tight. "Should we be worried? I don't know. Maybe we should get in the car." "Wait. Let me try something." She raised the DSLR and looked through the viewfinder one more time. Empty sky. The triangle was close enough now that she could discern structure between the 3 points, a dark surface, geometric and angular, connecting the lights into a single coherent form. But through the camera, nothing. Stars. Darkness. The faithful, useless recording of an empty sky. The triangle kept approaching. 200 yards. Close enough to make out details that distance had previously obscured. The 3 lights were not separate objects. They were apertures, windows or emitter ports, set into the corners of something larger. A craft. Dark material that absorbed ambient light with the completeness of a black body. Triangular planform, each side perhaps 60 feet in length. 100 yards. The landscape photographer could feel something now. A pressure in the air. A subsonic vibration that resonated in her sternum and her jaw. The way standing near a subwoofer at full volume produces a physical sensation that exists below the threshold of hearing. But there was no sound. Just pressure. Just vibration. A force that her bones registered and her ears could not. 50 yards. The craft was directly overhead now, filling the sky above them. The 3 corner lights cast a triangle of pale illumination on the desert floor, the observers standing within it like specimens on a slide. The dark surface between the lights was featureless. No seams, no panels, no visible hardware of any kind. Just smooth, light-absorbing material that seemed more like an absence than a substance. She raised her camera one final time. Pointed the lens straight up at the underside of a craft, hovering perhaps 30 feet above her head. Through the viewfinder, empty sky. Stars. Nothing else. She lowered the camera and looked up with her naked eyes. The craft was there. Massive. Silent. Impossible. Real. Her companion was shouting her name from somewhere near the car. She barely heard him through the pressure in her skull. The vibration intensified. Her ears popped, a sharp, painful equalization as though the atmospheric pressure had changed by several millibars in an instant. The taste of metal flooded her mouth, coating her tongue with the sharp, mineral flavor of copper. The vibration in her bones crossed from uncomfortable into something approaching pain, a deep, structural resonance, as though her skeleton were being used as a tuning fork by something that wanted to know what frequency human bone vibrated at. Then it stopped. All of it, the pressure, the vibration, the metallic taste, the sense of being studied, ceased simultaneously, as though a switch had been thrown. And when the landscape photographer looked up, the craft was gone. Not departing. Not ascending. Gone, absent from the sky with the same instantaneous completeness as a light being extinguished. One heartbeat it was there, a 60-foot triangular object hovering 30 feet above her. The next heartbeat, empty stars. Her companion ran to her. "Are you okay?" Yeah, I'm okay." "What the hell was that?" "I don't know." They checked the cameras. The DSLR time-lapse, 300 frames. She scrolled through them rapidly. Desert, stars, empty sky in every image. The mirrorless continuous sequence, nearly 1,000 photographs. She spot-checked dozens. Nothing. The action camera, 47 minutes of video. She scrubbed through the footage. The desert, the two of them standing around looking upward at nothing. No triangle, no craft, no evidence. "Nothing," she said. 3 cameras, 3 different sensor technologies, and none of them captured a single frame of evidence. But we both saw it. We both felt it. So what does that mean? She looked at the empty sky. It means we're not hallucinating. It means this is real. But it also means we will never be able to prove it. They did not return to Rachel that night. They sat in the desert until sunrise, barely speaking, the silence between them no longer comfortable but loaded with the weight of shared impossibility. Around 5 a.m., the landscape photographer broke the quiet. "I need to understand this. There has to be an explanation." "Aliens," her companion said. "The explanation is aliens." "That's not an explanation. That's a label we apply to things we don't understand." "Okay, then what's yours?" "Some natural phenomenon that looks like a 60-foot triangle and hovers silently overhead and makes your bones vibrate." "I don't know. But there has to be some physical mechanism. Some reason why we can perceive it, but electronic sensors can't." She opened her laptop and resumed her research. This time she bypassed the UFO forums and searched for scientific literature. Atmospheric optics, electromagnetic field effects on biological perception, anything that might bridge the gap between what her eyes had reported and what her cameras had denied. She found articles about Fata Morgana, complex mirages that could make distant objects appear where they weren't. But those required specific atmospheric conditions and would not explain selective camera blindness. She read about ball lightning, rare electrical phenomena still poorly understood. But ball lightning was chaotic and transient. It did not form geometric structures or hover for extended periods. She found papers about atmospheric disturbances near military testing sites, ionized air, electromagnetic radiation, but nothing that accounted for a 60-foot craft visible to the naked eye and invisible to 3 separate camera systems. Around 7:15 a.m., she found something that made her pause. A scientific paper from 1998 discussing selective perception phenomena in electromagnetic fields. The abstract described cases where strong electromagnetic radiation could stimulate the human optic nerve directly, creating the perception of light that had no external physical source. The paper called these induced phosphenes, hallucinations generated by electromagnetic stimulation of the brain's visual cortex. But the paper was explicit: induced phosphenes were subjective. No 2 individuals would perceive the same image. The brain interpreted electromagnetic stimulation idiosyncratically. Each person's phosphene would be unique to their neural architecture. She and her companion had seen the exact same thing. Same triangle. Same movements. Same structural details. That eliminated individual hallucination unless both of their visual cortexes were being stimulated by an external source that directed the perception, broadcasting a specific image into their brains with enough precision to produce identical subjective experiences. That would require technology so far beyond current human capability that it brought her directly back to the conclusion she had been trying to avoid. She closed the laptop. They drove back to Rachel in morning light. The town looked different without the darkness to lend it mystery, just a small desert settlement capitalizing on its geography and its legends. The landscape photographer was loading her camera gear into the vehicle when she noticed someone watching from the restaurant entrance. An older man, 65, perhaps, wearing jeans and a faded button-up shirt. He had the weathered, deep-lined face of someone who had spent decades in direct sunlight, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, carrying the focused clarity of a mind that had been paying attention for a very long time. "You folks see something last night?" he called out. She hesitated. Why do you ask? Saw you come back late. Saw you drive out again before dawn. That's usually a sign. Do a lot of people see things out here? The old resident walked over. Up close, she could see that his hands were steady and his posture was straight. A man accustomed to open spaces and the patience they required. More than most folks realize. Name's not important. Been living in Rachel 32 years. They shook hands. The landscape photographer introduced herself and her companion by first names only. Her companion ran to her. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. What the hell was that? I don't know. They checked the cameras. The DSLR time-lapse, 300 frames. She scrolled through them rapidly. Desert. Stars. Empty sky in every image. The mirrorless continuous sequence. Nearly 1,000 photographs. She spot-checked dozens. Nothing. The action camera. 47 minutes of video. She scrubbed through the footage. The desert, the two of them standing around looking upward at nothing. No triangle, no craft, no evidence. Nothing, she said. 3 cameras, 3 different sensor technologies, and none of them captured a single frame of evidence. But we both saw it. We both felt it. So what does that mean? She looked at the empty sky. It means we're not hallucinating. It means this is real. But it also means we will never be able to prove it. They did not return to Rachel that night. They sat in the desert until sunrise, barely speaking, the silence between them no longer comfortable but loaded with the weight of shared impossibility. Around 5 a.m., the landscape photographer broke the quiet. I need to understand this. There has to be an explanation. Aliens, her companion said. The explanation is aliens. That's not an explanation. That's a label we apply to things we don't understand. Okay, then what's yours? Some natural phenomenon that looks like a 60-foot triangle and hovers silently overhead and makes your bones vibrate. I don't know, but there has to be some physical mechanism. Some reason why we can perceive it, but electronic sensors can't. She opened her laptop and resumed her research. This time she bypassed the UFO forums and searched for scientific literature, atmospheric optics, electromagnetic field effects on biological perception, anything that might bridge the gap between what her eyes had reported and what her cameras had denied. She found articles about fata morgana, complex mirages that could make distant objects appear where they weren't. But those required specific atmospheric conditions and would not explain selective camera blindness. She read about ball lightning, rare electrical phenomena still poorly understood. But ball lightning was chaotic and transient. It did not form geometric structures or hover for extended periods. She found papers about atmospheric disturbances near military testing sites, ionized air, electromagnetic radiation, but nothing that accounted for a 60-foot craft visible to the naked eye and invisible to 3 separate camera systems. Around 7:15 a.m., she found something that made her pause. A scientific paper from 1998 discussing selective perception phenomena in electromagnetic fields. The abstract described cases where strong electromagnetic radiation could stimulate the human optic nerve directly, creating the perception of light that had no external physical source. The paper called these induced phosphenes, hallucinations generated by electromagnetic stimulation of the brain's visual cortex. But the paper was explicit: induced phosphenes were subjective. No 2 individuals would perceive the same image. The brain interpreted electromagnetic stimulation idiosyncratically. Each person's phosphene would be unique to their neural architecture. She and her companion had seen the exact same thing. Same triangle. Same movements. Same structural details. That eliminated individual hallucination unless both of their visual cortexes were being stimulated by an external source that directed the perception, broadcasting a specific image into their brains with enough precision to produce identical subjective experiences. That would require technology so far beyond current human capability that it brought her directly back to the conclusion she had been trying to avoid. She closed the laptop. They drove back to Rachel in morning light. The town looked different without the darkness to lend it mystery. Just a small desert settlement capitalizing on its geography and its legends. The landscape photographer was loading her camera gear into the vehicle when she noticed someone watching from the restaurant entrance. An older man, 65, perhaps, wearing jeans and a faded button-up shirt. He had the weathered, deep-lined face of someone who had spent decades in direct sunlight, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, carrying the focused clarity of a mind that had been paying attention for a very long time. "You folks see something last night?" he called out. She hesitated. "Why do you ask?" "Saw you come back late. Saw you drive out again before dawn. That's usually a sign. Do a lot of people see things out here?" The old resident walked over. Up close, she could see that his hands were steady and his posture was straight. A man accustomed to open spaces and the patience they required. More than most folks realize. Name's not important. Been living in Rachel 32 years. They shook hands. The landscape photographer introduced herself and her companion by first names only. "Let me guess," the old resident said. "Triangle lights. 3 points. White-blue color. Appeared on the horizon. Cameras couldn't capture it." A chill moved through her despite the morning sun. "How did you know?" "Because that's what people see about once a month out here. Sometimes more frequently. Been happening for years. And everyone reports the same camera problems. Plenty of people have tried, professionals, amateurs, folks with military-grade equipment. The triangle never shows up on camera." "Why? What is it?" "Hell if I know. But I'll tell you what I think, for whatever it's worth." He glanced at the highway, then lowered his voice, not because anyone was listening, but because certain things demanded quieter delivery. "I think whatever's out there doesn't want to be photographed. I think it can detect when recording equipment is pointed at it. And I think it does something, actively, deliberately, to ensure those recordings come back empty." "That's impossible," she said. "So is a 60-foot triangle floating silently over the desert." "But you saw that too, didn't you?" She didn't answer. "How many people have seen it?" she asked instead. "Hard to say. Most don't talk about it. But I've personally spoken with 24 witnesses over the years who described the same phenomenon. Triangle formation. Camera failures. Some felt pressure when it got close. Others saw it change shape or vanish. All of them left confused and unable to prove what happened. Has anyone tried to approach it? Get close enough to touch it?" His expression darkened, the lines in his face deepening, his eyes losing their warmth. "One person I know of. Young man from California, maybe 8 years back. Drove out here specifically looking for UFOs. Saw the triangle and decided to chase it. Took his Jeep right toward it. Crossed into the restricted zone. What happened? Air Force found his vehicle 3 days later. 10 miles past the boundary. Engine dead. Doors locked. The kid was gone. Never found." The landscape photographer felt her stomach contract. "You think the triangle took him?" "I think he got too close to something that doesn't want to be approached. Whether it was the triangle or military security or something else entirely, I couldn't say. But the triangle's been appearing around here for as long as I've lived in Rachel. And every so often, someone decides to chase it. Those people tend not to come back." He produced a card from his wallet, plain white stock, a name and phone number handwritten in careful block letters. "No business. No logo. No affiliation. If you ever want to talk about what you saw, call me. I've been collecting accounts for years, trying to piece together a pattern. Can't promise answers, but at least you'll be talking to someone who believes you." She took the card. "Thank you. One more thing." He glanced at the highway. "If you see it again, anywhere, not just here, I'd like to know. Because the triangle doesn't restrict itself to Nevada. It shows up in other states, other countries. And every time, the same thing happens. People see it clearly. Cameras don't capture it. And nobody believes the witnesses. You think it's following people? Her companion asked. I think it's studying people. Watching. Learning. And I think it's been doing that for a very long time. The old resident tipped his hat and walked back toward the restaurant. 3 weeks later, the landscape photographer was back in Flagstaff, attempting to reassemble a normal life from materials that no longer fit together properly. She processed her Nevada photographs, selected the strongest star trail compositions, added them to her portfolio. They were beautiful, technically flawless, aesthetically compelling, exactly the images she had driven to Nevada to create. Nobody examining them would ever suspect that during those exposures, a massive triangular craft had hovered overhead. The files bore no trace of it. She found herself staring at those images late at night, questioning her own experience. Had she imagined it? Had fatigue or the suggestive power of the location manufactured a shared hallucination? But then she would remember the pressure in the air, the vibration in her bones, the metallic taste flooding her mouth. And she would remember that her companion had experienced every detail identically. Their accounts matched with the precision of instruments calibrated to the same standard. That could not be hallucination. On December 3rd, her phone rang. The old resident from Rachel. After you saw the triangle, he said without preamble, did you have any strange dreams? The question startled her. Dreams? Why? Just answer. She hesitated. She had been having strange dreams nearly every night since returning. Dreams of standing in the desert watching the triangle rotate overhead. Dreams where the three lights separated and formed patterns she could not reproduce on waking. Dreams that felt less like imagination and more like memory, as though her sleeping brain were replaying an experience that her waking brain had not fully recorded. Yes, she admitted. How did you know? Because everyone who sees the triangle reports the same thing. Dreams start a week or two after the sighting. Continue for about a month. Then they stop. What are they? I don't know. But I have a theory. When you see the triangle, something happens to your brain, like an impression, a residual mark. Your brain processes that mark through dreams, trying to integrate an experience that doesn't fit into any existing category. That's actually reasonable. There's more. The dreams change over time. First few weeks, they're replays, same perspective as the original sighting. But later, they start showing new material. Different angles. Different vantage points. As though your brain is extrapolating, filling in information that wasn't consciously observed. She thought about her recent dreams. He was right. The early ones had been faithful reproductions of the sighting. But lately, the perspective had shifted. Sometimes she observed the triangle from above, sometimes from inside, though she had no waking memory of ever being within the craft. Keep a journal, he said. Write down everything you remember. Dates, times, details, perspectives. I'm collecting data from every witness I can reach, looking for patterns. She began keeping the journal. Every morning, she transcribed her dreams. December 5th, triangle in the desert. 3 lights rotating. Standard replay. December 8th, triangle closer. Could see the dark material between the lights. Felt like I could reach out and touch the surface. December 12th, not in the desert. Somewhere else. Inside something. Curved walls. Soft blue illumination. A sense of being observed by something I couldn't see. December 15th, triangle again, but not alone. Multiple triangles. Dozens of them filling the sky, moving in coordinated formation like a fleet. December 19th, not a triangle. Something else entirely. Disc-shaped. Silver. Hovering over a city I didn't recognize. The dreams were diverging from the source experience. less like memory and more like vision. She mentioned this to the old resident during one of their weekly calls. That's consistent with what others report, he said. First the dreams match the sighting. Then they start showing other craft, other locations. It's as if the experience opened a channel. A channel to what? He paused. To awareness. To perception of things that are always present but normally invisible. Like learning to see in a new spectrum of light. That sounds unscientific. So does a triangle that's invisible to cameras. But you saw it. On December 23rd, her companion called. You need to check your email. Now. She opened her laptop. He had sent a link to a news article from New Zealand. Mysterious triangle lights reported over Auckland. Multiple witnesses had observed 3 lights in triangular formation on December 20th. The lights had rotated, separated, and vanished. No photographs or video had captured the phenomenon clearly, though several people had attempted recording. It's the same thing, he said. Same triangle. Same behavior. Same camera problems. Other side of the planet. It could be coincidental. Triangular UFO sightings are common. Read the comments. She scrolled down. Dozens of people from around the world describing identical experiences. Belgium, Japan, Argentina, South Africa. The same geometric formation. The same silent movement. The same camera failures. And several commenters mentioned the dreams, vivid, recurring, beginning days after the sighting. It's everywhere, her companion said. It's been happening everywhere. We're not the only ones. Over the following days, the landscape photographer searched systematically. She found thousands of triangle reports spanning decades. Most had been dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. But the consistency was remarkable. 3 lights, geometric formation, silent operation, selective invisibility to recording equipment. On January 2, 2020, an unknown number appeared on her phone. Is this the landscape photographer who had an experience in Nevada last November? A woman's voice, calm, precise, academic. Who is this? I'm a researcher studying unusual aerial phenomena. The gentleman from Rachel shared your contact information, with your permission. I'm part of a private research group, not military, not governmental. Scientists collecting data on a phenomenon that is clearly occurring but poorly understood. What do you want? Your account. And if you're willing, your photo files. Even though they didn't capture the triangle, the metadata might contain information we can analyze. The landscape photographer agreed. She told the researcher everything. When she finished, the researcher said, that matches what we've documented from other witnesses. Now, about those files. 3 days later, the researcher called back. We found something. Your time-lapse sequence has a gap. A gap. Your images are time-stamped every 30 seconds. But there's a 4-minute period during your sighting where no frames exist. The sequence jumps from 10:47 p.m. to 10:51 p.m. No images in between. The landscape photographer checked immediately. The researcher was right. She had been so focused on searching for the triangle in the images that she had never noticed the missing frames. 4 minutes of absent data during the exact period when the craft had been directly overhead. That's impossible. The intervalometer was running continuously. It doesn't pause. It doesn't skip. It didn't skip. The frames are simply absent, as though they were never created, or as though they were created and subsequently removed from the memory card. Removed? By what? We don't know. But it's consistent with other cases. Cameras don't just fail to capture the phenomenon. Sometimes they lose data entirely. Files vanish. Timestamps corrupt. Memory cards develop anomalies that weren't present before the event. You're telling me something actively prevents this phenomenon from being recorded. That's our working hypothesis. Whatever the triangle is, it possesses some mechanism for interfering with recording equipment. Not just visual sensors, but audio recorders, video cameras, even radar installations in certain documented cases. That's not achievable with any technology we currently possess. I know. Which is precisely what makes it significant. After the call ended, the landscape photographer sat with her laptop, staring at the gap in her sequence. 4 minutes of missing time. For minutes during which a 60-foot craft had hovered 30 feet above her head, and her camera had simply stopped creating records of reality. She thought about the old residence theory, the triangle studying humanity, watching, learning, conducting its observations with a patience that suggested its operators measured their existence on scales that made human lifetimes look like the flicker of a match. She thought about the researchers' data, hundreds of witnesses, consistent reports, camera failures that defied every model of electromagnetic interference she had studied. Whatever the triangle was, it was real. It was intelligent. And it was being extraordinarily careful not to leave evidence behind. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in the Nevada desert at 2 in the morning. It is not merely the absence of sound. It is deeper than that. More architectural, more deliberate. It is as though the world has drawn a breath and forgotten to release it, as though the atmosphere itself has entered a state of suspension, waiting for permission to resume. The wildlife observer knew that silence intimately. He had been working for the Bureau of Land Management for 6 years, spending the majority of his nights alone in the desert, documenting the behavior of nocturnal species with the patient discipline of a man who found more meaning in data than in conversation. His current assignment was tracking kit fox populations in the buffer zone northwest of Groom Lake, a task that placed him uncomfortably close to restricted military territory, but that the endangered species protections mandated regardless of the military's preferences. Biodiversity trumped operational security, at least on the paperwork. His setup was simple and self-contained. A portable observation blind positioned roughly 8 miles from the nearest restricted boundary, equipped with night vision cameras, motion sensors, and enough battery capacity to sustain 3 days of continuous recording. He would park his truck a quarter-mile away and hike in at dusk, staying quiet, staying invisible, watching the desert conduct its nocturnal business without the contaminating presence of a human observer. On February 14, 2020, the wildlife observer was on his 3rd night of a planned 5-night session. The kit foxes were active, 2 distinct family groups documented, clear footage of hunting and denning behavior captured, the kind of data that would satisfy his supervisors and justify the continuation of the program. The work was going well. At 2:17 a.m., he was reviewing footage on his laptop when he noticed an anomaly in the peripheral camera feeds. A glow on the northern horizon, faint, bluish, unlike any light source that should exist in that direction. Not moonlight. Not starlight. Something with its own character, its own frequency, pulsing gently against the dark like a slow, luminous heartbeat. He switched to the live feed from the north-facing camera. The glow was unmistakable, a soft blue radiance sitting low on the horizon, brightening and dimming in a rhythm that felt biological rather than mechanical. He consulted his topographic map. There was nothing in that direction. No roads, no structures, no infrastructure of any kind. Just empty desert stretching toward the restricted boundary. He grabbed his binoculars and stepped outside the blind. The February air struck him immediately, sharp, dry cold that turned his breath into small, dissolving clouds. The glow was visible to his naked eyes now, more distinct through the clean desert atmosphere than it had appeared on the camera feed. Through the binoculars, he could resolve additional detail. The light was not emanating from a point source. It was diffuse, scattered, as though being refracted through fog or particulate matter. But the air was bone dry. Humidity in the Great Basin in February hovered near single digits. There was no medium to scatter light through. He checked his watch. 2:19 a.m. He pulled out his field notebook and began writing by flashlight, the instinct of a scientist trained to document everything, even things he did not yet understand. 2:19 a.m. Bluish glow observed north of blind, approximate 5 to 6 miles. Distant. Camera equipment showing possible interference. Possible electromagnetic source. As he wrote, he became aware of a sensation he could not quite categorize. A shift in the environment, not auditory, not visual, but atmospheric. As though the air pressure had changed by a fraction of a millibar. His ears did not pop, but his body registered something adjacent to that sensation. A subtle realignment of the space he occupied, as though the desert had exhaled and inhaled at a slightly different rhythm. The glow pulsed brighter. Then brighter again. The wildlife observer set down his notebook and watched. The blue radiance was expanding, spreading across the northern horizon like the slow unfurling of a luminous curtain, still silent, still gentle, but growing with a steady inevitability that suggested purpose rather than randomness. Then it stopped. Not fading. Not retreating. Simply stopping, the light reaching a certain radius and holding position, forming a dome of soft blue luminance over a patch of desert he could not quite see clearly at this distance. He checked his watch. 2:23 a.m. Wait. He looked at the watch again. The second hand was moving normally, its steady sweep around the dial uninterrupted. The minute hand showed 2:21. That could not be right. He had checked the time at 2:19. He had written in his notebook, that entry was dated 2:19. He had then observed the glow for what felt like several minutes, watching it expand, watching it stabilize. Several minutes of subjective observation should have advanced the time to at least 2:22, more likely 2:24 or 2:25. But his watch read 2:21 a.m., 2 minutes earlier than the last recorded timestamp in his notebook. He tapped the crystal. Mechanical watches sometimes stuck in cold weather, the lubricant thickening, the balance wheel losing amplitude. But the second hand moved smoothly, sweeping through its arc with the consistent rhythm of a properly functioning movement. He pulled out his phone. The screen was displaying interference, pixelated distortion that made the digits barely legible. But he could make out the time in the corner, 2:21 a.m., the same as his watch. 2 minutes had vanished. 2 minutes between writing in his notebook and checking his instruments again. 2 minutes that should have elapsed but had not. Or had elapsed and been retracted, pulled back, rewound, like tape being spooled in reverse through a mechanism he could not see. Missing time. That phrase lived in the vocabulary of UFO encounters and abduction narratives, hours disappearing from clocks, witnesses losing entire segments of their night. But this was the inverse. Not missing time but reverse time. Time that had moved forward and then moved back, as though the arrow of causality had briefly pointed in both directions simultaneously. The blue glow began to fade. Rapidly, the dome of light collapsing inward, the luminance draining from the sky like water through a sieve, until in the space of perhaps 5 seconds the northern horizon returned to its natural darkness and the desert looked exactly as it had before the phenomenon began. The wildlife observer stood outside his blind, breathing fast, trying to construct a rational narrative from irrational data. He checked his watch. 2:23 a.m. time was advancing normally now. Whatever had happened was over. He went back inside and checked his equipment. The cameras were operational again, the interference cleared, the feeds showing normal desert. He scrubbed back through the recorded footage to 2:17 a.m., when the glow had first appeared. The footage showed the northern horizon. Dark. Empty. No glow. No blue light. Nothing. He continued scrubbing. 2:18. 2:19. 2:20. Nothing unusual in any of the frames. Then at 2:21 a.m., the video jumped. One frame showed normal darkness. The next frame showed the same view, but the timestamp had advanced by 4 seconds. From 2 hours 21 minutes and 17 seconds to 2 hours 21 minutes and 21 seconds. 4 seconds of footage simply absent from the recording. He checked every camera. All of them had the same gap, an identical 4-second void at precisely 2:21 a.m. The footage before the gap was clean. The footage after the gap was clean. But those 4 seconds had been excised from every recording device simultaneously. What the hell? He whispered. He spent the next hour cross-referencing everything. His field notes. His watch readings. The camera timestamps. trying to construct a timeline that obeyed the laws of causality. At 2:17, glow observed. At 2:19, time noted in field notebook. At some point after 2:19, he experienced several minutes of observation. But when he checked his instruments, they read 2:21, 2 minutes earlier than they should have. And the cameras showed a 4-second gap at 2:21. None of it cohered. Time did not run backward. Cameras did not lose 4 seconds of footage without mechanical explanation. And glows did not appear in empty desert, pulse like breathing organisms, and vanish without leaving a trace on any recording device. He should report this. The BLM had protocols for unusual field observations. But what would he write? Observed blue light. Lost 2 minutes. Cameras have a 4-second gap. All of this occurred near Area 51. They would assume he was fabricating UFO stories or experiencing a psychological episode. Either way, his field credibility, 6 years of meticulous documentation, would be destroyed. He decided to continue his observation session. Document the foxes. Complete the assignment. Keep the anomalous incident to himself until he could determine what had actually happened. At 2:47 a.m., his satellite phone rang. He stared at it. The satellite phone was an emergency instrument, issued by the BLM for situations where cellular coverage was unavailable, which in this part of Nevada meant always. He had carried it for 6 years. It had never rung. Not once. He answered. Is this the wildlife observer assigned to the Northwest Buffer Zone? A man's voice, calm, controlled, professional. Yes. Who is this? I work in field analysis for a private security contractor operating in this area. I'm calling because our monitoring equipment detected unusual electromagnetic readings approximately 30 minutes ago. Your position was within the affected zone. Did you observe anything unusual tonight? The wildlife observer felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. What kind of readings? Electromagnetic anomalies. Brief but significant. Originating from a location approximately 6 miles north of your current position. How do you know where I am? You're registered with the BLM for wildlife observation in this sector. We maintain awareness of civilian presence in the buffer zones for safety purposes. Now, did you observe anything unusual? He hesitated. Admitting what he had seen could compromise his clearance. Denying it seemed pointless. The person on the phone clearly already knew something had happened. I saw a blue glow, he said. North of my position. It appeared around 2:17 and disappeared around 2:23. My cameras malfunctioned during the event. There's a 4-second gap in the footage at 2:21. A pause. Then, what kind of malfunction? Interference. Static on the feeds. And the footage gap, 4 seconds missing simultaneously across all cameras. A longer pause. Muffled voices in the background, the field analyst consulting with someone offline. I need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't move from your current position. I'm coming to you. 20 minutes. Wait, why? What's happening? I'll explain when I arrive. Stay put. This is important. 23 minutes later, headlights appeared in the eastern darkness. A vehicle approaching over rough terrain, bouncing through the scrub. It stopped near the wildlife observer's truck, and a man emerged. Tall, approximately 40, wearing tactical clothing and carrying a flashlight he kept pointed at the ground. They sat in the field analyst's vehicle, a modified SUV with equipment racks and multiple displays built into the dashboard, more mobile command center than transport. Who exactly do you work for? The wildlife observer asked. A private contractor that monitors the buffer zones around restricted government facilities. We track intrusions, environmental hazards, unusual activity. Tonight, we detected a significant electromagnetic pulse at 2:21 a.m., originating from approximately 6 miles north of your position. The blue glow. Possibly. Did you observe the source clearly? No. Too far. Just the glow on the horizon. But my cameras failed, and I lost time. My watch ran backward. The field analyst's expression sharpened. Backward. Explain. The wildlife observer described the sequence, checking his watch at 2:19, writing the timestamp, observing the glow for what felt like several minutes, then finding his watch reading 2:21. 2 minutes earlier than expected. Time that appeared to have reversed. The field analyst typed notes into a tablet. May I see your watch? He examined it carefully, checking the movement, the second hand, the date complication. Standard mechanical watch. No electronic components. These don't malfunction from electromagnetic interference. So what happened? The field analyst leaned back. I'm going to share something that isn't common knowledge. What I'm about to say falls under multiple security classifications, but given what you experienced tonight, you need context. Go ahead. The electromagnetic pulse we detected at 2:21 a.m. was not the first. We've recorded similar pulses approximately once every 2 to 3 months for the past 4 years. They always originate from the same general location, always occur between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m., and they always coincide with reports of unusual visual phenomena, glows, lights, formations, that don't correspond to any known activity in the area. You're talking about UAPs. I'm talking about unidentified aerial phenomena that produce measurable electromagnetic effects and that correlate with perceptual anomalies in witnesses. Whether they're alien, classified military technology, or something else entirely, I don't know. But they're real. They're recurring. And they have documented effects on people who observe them. Effects like reverse time. Among others. Some witnesses report time accelerating. Some report it slowing. Some report discrepancies between their watches and external clocks. And almost everyone reports camera malfunctions or missing footage. How many people have seen these things? Difficult to quantify. Most observers in this area are either military personnel bound by classification or civilians who don't want to damage their credibility. But we've documented at least 30 separate incidents over 4 years. And what does your company do with this data? Collect it. Analyze it. Look for patterns. Report up the chain to whoever funds the operation, a consortium of private interests who want to understand what's actually happening in this desert. The field analyst pulled up a graph on his tablet. This is electromagnetic spectrum analysis from 2:15 to 2:30 a.m. tonight. The graph showed a relatively flat baseline with minor fluctuations, then at exactly 2 hours 21 minutes and 17 seconds, a massive vertical spike. The line shot upward, held at peak intensity for precisely 4 seconds, then dropped back to baseline. 4 seconds, the wildlife observer said. The same duration as the gap in my footage. Exactly. The pulse was powerful enough to blind every electronic sensor within a mile radius. But it didn't destroy the equipment, it just prevented recording during the pulse window. Like it created a blind spot. Precisely. And the time discrepancy? My watch running backward. The field analyst was quiet for a moment. I have a theory. It's speculative. Probably sounds absurd. After tonight, I'm prepared for absurd. What if time didn't run backward? What if it ran at different speeds in different locations? The wildlife observer frowned. Consider this. You were standing outside your blind. I was at my station 15 miles east. What if the electromagnetic pulse created a localized field where time moved differently? Inside the field, time slowed, or perhaps compressed. Outside, it moved normally. From your subjective perspective, several minutes passed. But from the perspective of your watch, which was on your wrist, inside the field, time moved at a different rate. That's relativistic time dilation. It requires extreme conditions, massive gravitational fields or velocities approaching light speed. According to Einstein, yes. But if something could generate a sufficiently powerful field through means we don't understand, it could theoretically create localized temporal distortion. Something like what? Something that produces electromagnetic pulses strong enough to blank every camera within a mile. Something that generates blue luminous domes over the desert floor. Something that's been doing it systematically, on a schedule, for at least 4 years. They sat in silence. Dawn was still distant, but the quality of the darkness had shifted, the stars dimming slightly at the eastern edge, the first faint suggestion that the planet was turning toward light. "What now?" the wildlife observer asked. "Now I take your footage, your field notes, and your account back for analysis. We compare it against previous incidents. And I reach out when we have results." The field analyst produced a business card, plain white stock, a name and phone number, nothing else. No company, no title, no institutional affiliation of any kind. "Call me if you see anything else, day or night, even if you think it's trivial." These phenomena tend to recur, and sometimes they focus on specific individuals. Focus. People who witness one event often witness others, as though observation creates a link. We don't understand the mechanism. That's deeply unsettling. Yes. Welcome to the field of UAP research. It's all deeply unsettling. The field analyst departed around 4 a.m. The wildlife observer remained in his blind, attempting to refocus on the kit foxes, but his concentration had been irreparably fractured. At 6:30, he packed his equipment and drove back to his apartment in Tonopah. He was scheduled for 2 more nights of observation. He could not bring himself to return. He spent 3 days researching time dilation, electromagnetic field effects, and anything else that might construct a rational framework around his experience. The deeper he read, the less coherent the framework became. Relativistic time dilation required gravitational fields produced by stellar mass objects or velocities that no macroscopic technology could achieve. You could not create localized temporal distortion with an electromagnetic pulse. The energy requirements would exceed the output of a nuclear reactor. Unless you possess technology so far beyond human engineering that the comparison ceased to be meaningful. On February 18th, the field analyst called. "I have preliminary results. Can you meet in person?" "Where?" "There's a diner in Goldfield. Can you be there in an hour?" The wildlife observer drove south. Goldfield was a near ghost town, a former mining settlement where the veins had played out and the population had followed, leaving behind faded buildings and a handful of operating businesses sustained by highway traffic and stubbornness. The diner was small, quiet, and largely empty. The field analyst was already seated in a corner booth, his tablet and several paper files spread across the table. "Here's what we have." He slid a folder across the surface. Every documented incident from the past 4 years. 32 events total. All within a 50-mile radius of Groom Lake. All exhibiting similar characteristics. The wildlife observer opened the folder. Incident reports, each one summarizing a different observation. Blue glows, white lights, triangular formations, disc-shaped objects. The descriptions varied in detail, but certain elements recurred with the consistency of a signature. Electromagnetic interference, camera malfunctions, temporal discrepancies. "Look at the timestamps," the field analyst said. The wildlife observer scanned the reports. The events occurred on different dates, but the times clustered. 2:21 a.m., 2:47 a.m., 3:13 a.m. specific times that repeated across incidents separated by months. "They're scheduled," he said. "That's our conclusion. Whatever produces these phenomena operates on a timetable." Scheduled by whom? That's the question we can't answer. The field analyst swiped to a different screen on his tablet. "Now look at this. Time discrepancies reported by witnesses, plotted against their distance and bearing from the phenomenon." The chart showed witness identifiers, dates, and temporal anomalies. Some witnesses had lost seconds. Some had lost minutes. One had apparently lost an entire hour while experiencing only 5 minutes subjectively. The wildlife observer's own incident appeared at the bottom. February 14th, 2020, -2 minutes. The discrepancies aren't random, the field analyst said. They correlate with position. Specifically, with compass bearing relative to the source. Bearing. Every witness who experienced time running backward was located north-northeast of the phenomenon. Every witness who experienced time accelerating was south-southwest. East and west experienced normal flow with minor fluctuations. A directional field. Like a temporal compass. Exactly. And 2 weeks ago, we had an incident with 2 simultaneous witnesses observing the same event from opposite bearings. The northern witness's watch gained 5 minutes. The southern witness lost 3. Same event. Same electromagnetic pulse. Opposite temporal effects. That's impossible. Time can't flow in different directions simultaneously. According to known physics, no. But if something could generate a field that warped spacetime directionally, creating gradients where time flows at different rates depending on your position, that would require technology so far beyond ours that the word technology barely applies. I know. They sat with their coffee cooling between them. The waitress refilled their cups. The wildlife observer waited until she was out of earshot. You're suggesting aliens. I'm suggesting something is creating localized spacetime distortions in the Nevada desert with a precision and regularity that rules out natural phenomena and exceeds any known human capability. Alien is one hypothesis. There are others. None of them are comfortable. After the diner meeting, the wildlife observer drove aimlessly through the desert, trying to metabolize everything the field analyst had shown him. 32 documented incidents. Directional time distortion. Scheduled electromagnetic pulses. A pattern so precise it suggested not natural phenomenon but protocol. Something operating according to rules, executing procedures, conducting operations with the mechanical regularity of a program that had been running long before anyone thought to look for it. Back in his apartment, he spent days reading through the incident reports. Each one told a variation of the same essential story. Someone in the wrong place at the right time, witnessing something impossible, walking away with more questions than the human mind was designed to carry. One report caught his attention. An incident from November 2019 involving a landscape photographer. She had seen triangular lights that maintained constant distance regardless of how close she walked. Her cameras had refused to capture the phenomenon. The wildlife observer found her professional website, desert landscapes, night photography, star trails. The kind of work that required patience, technical precision, and long hours alone in darkness. He recognized a kindred discipline. On impulse, he sent an email. I'm a wildlife observer with the BLM. I recently had an experience near Area 51 involving unusual lights and camera malfunctions. I came across a report mentioning you had a similar experience. I'm trying to understand what I saw. Would you be willing to talk? He did not expect a response. 2 hours later, his phone rang. I got your email, the landscape photographer said. Tell me everything. He described the blue glow, the camera interference, the 4-second gap, the watch running backward. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. That's different from my experience, but the camera problems are identical. Multiple systems, all failing to capture something that was clearly visible. I've tried every explanation: electromagnetic interference, atmospheric phenomena, equipment failure. Nothing fits. Someone told me that witnesses of one event tend to witness others. Has that been your experience? No. I saw the triangle once. Never again. Though I had strange dreams for about a month afterward. Different perspectives. Sometimes I was seeing the triangle from above, sometimes from inside. The wildlife observer thought about his own dreams, the blue glow, time moving in different directions, the sensation of existing at multiple temporal coordinates simultaneously. Do you think they're real? He asked. The phenomena. Do you think they're physically happening, or are we experiencing some kind of shared perceptual anomaly? They're real, she said without hesitation. Too many independent witnesses. Too much consistency across reports. That's not hallucination. That's observation. So, what are they? I wish I knew. I've been in contact with a researcher who studies UAPs. She's collected hundreds of accounts. According to her, these phenomena have been occurring for decades, possibly much longer, and they're not random. They follow patterns. I've seen some of those patterns. Specific times, specific dates, directional temporal effects. Then you're ahead of where I was. When I saw the triangle, I thought it was isolated. But the more I learn, the more I realize this is systematic. Organized. Whatever's creating these events is doing so with intention. They talked for another hour, the landscape photographer sharing what she had learned from the researcher and from the old desert resident in Rachel, the wildlife observer sharing the field analyst's electromagnetic data and temporal mapping. Two strangers connected by the impossible, building a composite picture from fragments that no single witness possessed in full. Before they hung up, she said, "Be careful. People who dig too deep into this tend to attract attention. Not all of it friendly." What do you mean? There are organizations that don't want this information becoming public. They go to considerable lengths to keep witnesses quiet. Are you scared? A little. But I'm more curious than scared. I need to understand what I saw, even if understanding is dangerous. On February 23rd, the field analyst called again. His voice carried an energy the wildlife observer hadn't heard before, controlled excitement, the sound of someone who has found a key and is not yet certain which door it opens. "We made a breakthrough with the footage. Can you come to our facility?" "Your facility? I thought you were private security." "We are. But we maintain a research lab. Unofficial. Off the books. About 60 miles northwest of Tonopah. I'll send coordinates." "Is it safe?" "Safer than meeting in public. And you'll want to see this in person." The wildlife observer drove out the next morning. The coordinates led to what appeared to be a decommissioned mining operation, weathered buildings, oxidized equipment, no indication of current activity. But when he knocked on the main building's door, it opened immediately. Inside was a different world. Computers, servers, monitoring equipment arranged in banks along the walls. Several people the wildlife observer did not recognize working at various stations. Men and women with the focused, unhurried demeanor of researchers deep in their respective problems. The space looked like the offspring of a university laboratory and a military command center, conceived in secrecy and raised on private funding. "Who are all these people?" the wildlife observer asked. "Researchers, analysts, former military, former space agency, former academics. People who became interested in UAPs and decided to dedicate their professional lives to understanding them. Come, I'll show you what we found." They went to a back room where a large monitor displayed the wildlife observer's camera footage. The 4-second gap was frozen on screen, blank frames, apparently empty, a void in the data where reality should have been recorded. "We ran the footage through several decryption algorithms," the field analyst said. "Standard approaches first. Then we applied unconventional methods based on the electromagnetic interference patterns we've cataloged from previous incidents. And we found this." He pressed a key. The blank frames resolved. The wildlife observer stepped closer. The image was distorted, pixelated, swimming with digital noise, like looking through frosted glass, but shapes were visible. The desert, the horizon, and something else. Something hovering above the ground that had not been there in the original footage. It was not the blue glow he had seen. This was a structure, geometric, angular, constructed from material that seemed to devour light rather than interact with it. Dark surfaces interrupted by bright points that might have been windows or emitters. A physical object of considerable size, occupying airspace that should have been empty. "What is that?" the wildlife observer whispered. "We don't know. But it was there during the 4-second gap. Your cameras captured it, even though you didn't consciously perceive it." How is that possible? I was looking directly at that location. If the structure was generating the electromagnetic field that produced the temporal distortion, it may have been invisible to biological perception while remaining detectable by electronic sensors. The field might affect organic visual processing differently than it affects camera sensors, selectively blocking one while inadvertently recording on the other. That contradicts every other case. The landscape photographer's cameras couldn't see the triangle, but her eyes could. I know. Which suggests the phenomenon can modulate its visibility in both directions, appearing to biological observers while hiding from cameras, or appearing to cameras while hiding from biological observers. Selective visibility, adjusted per encounter. The wildlife observer studied the distorted image. Through the noise and the pixelation, the structure was undeniably present. Solid. Real. Occupying physical space with the unmistakable authority of something that existed regardless of who was looking. Have you found this in other footage? He asked. We've just begun going through the archives. But yes, several other incidents contain similar encrypted data in their blank segments. We're recovering all of it. And when you do, when you have clear images, then we'll have proof. Real, undeniable proof that something is operating in Nevada airspace. Something that can manipulate spacetime and electromagnetic fields. Something that doesn't want to be documented but can't completely conceal itself from electronic sensors. The field analyst pulled up another screen. There's more. Remember the incident with two witnesses experiencing opposite temporal effects. The northern witness gained 5 minutes. The southern witness lost 3. We recovered footage from both. Here's what the northern camera recorded. Distorted footage, similar quality to the wildlife observer's recovery, but in this recording the structure was closer, more defined, and it was moving. Not flying. Rotating. Spinning on an invisible axis with slow, deliberate purpose. And here's the southern camera. Different angle. Same structure. But in this footage, it was not rotating. It was expanding and contracting, pulsing, the entire form growing and shrinking rhythmically, as though it were breathing. They recorded the same object doing different things, the wildlife observer said slowly. Or they recorded different aspects of the same event. As though the object existed in multiple states simultaneously, and each observer's position determined which state they perceived. That's quantum superposition, at macroscopic scale. Which suggests that whatever this is, it operates according to physical laws we don't fully understand. Laws that permit time distortion and superposition at scales visible to the naked eye. The wildlife observer felt the floor tilt beneath his comprehension. This was beyond his expertise, beyond anyone's expertise. A phenomenon that casually violated the boundaries between quantum mechanics and classical physics, between the microscopic and the macroscopic, between the theoretically possible and the observationally real. What do we do with this? He asked. That's the question I can't resolve. My company wants to keep it internal, study it, monetize it eventually. But that feels like a betrayal. If something this significant is occurring, the public has a right to know. Going public would end both our careers. Probably worse. And staying silent feels like complicity in the largest cover-up in human history. They stood in the dim room, watching the distorted footage play on loop. The structure rotating, expanding, existing in states that no single observer could witness simultaneously. A thing from outside the rules, documented by instruments that barely understood what they had captured. "I need time to think," the wildlife observer said. "Take whatever you need. But be careful. People have been keeping this secret for decades. They won't appreciate anyone attempting to dismantle it." The wildlife observer did not go home. He drove through the desert, letting the empty miles metabolize what he had learned. The footage, the structure, the implications. His phone rang. The phenomena researcher, the woman the landscape photographer had mentioned. She had obtained his contact information through their mutual connection. "The phenomena you experienced is part of a larger pattern," she said. "A pattern suggesting organized, systematic activity operating on a global scale." "I'm listening." "The time discrepancies correlate with proximity and bearing. We've documented cases spanning decades, time running backward, forward, faster, slower. All of it depends on the observer's position relative to the source. The field analyst showed me some of that data." "Good. Then you understand we're dealing with something that manipulates space-time itself. Not just electromagnetic fields, the fundamental fabric of reality. That level of capability suggests something far beyond current human engineering." "You think it's non-human." "I think it's not human. Whether it's extraterrestrial, extradimensional, or something we don't have a category for, I can't say with certainty. But the military is as confused as the rest of us. I have contacts who've confirmed these events occur in restricted airspace without authorization. They detect them. They scramble jets. And by the time anyone arrives, the phenomenon has vanished." "Why Nevada? Why this desert?" "Remoteness. Low population density. Pre-existing association with classified activity. Reports from this area are automatically dismissed as conspiracy theories. It's the ideal location for observation if you want to study a species without being studied in return." On the same night, driven by a compulsion he could not fully rationalize, the wildlife observer returned to the site of his original encounter. He set up his equipment, cameras, sensors, his laptop synchronized to atomic time via satellite. If the phenomena operated on a schedule, if they appeared at precise intervals, perhaps they would appear again. He waited through the evening hours. 8 p.m. Nothing. Midnight. Silence. At 2:17 a.m., exactly 9 days after his first sighting, the blue glow appeared. Same location. Same color. Same gentle, rhythmic pulsation. As though it had been waiting for him to return. This time, he was prepared. Multiple cameras recording from different angles. Electromagnetic sensors running at maximum sensitivity. His watch synchronized to the millisecond. The glow brightened. The pressure in the air shifted. His ears popped. And his watch began running backward, the second hand sweeping counterclockwise, the minute hand ticking in reverse. He watched it happen in real time, staring at the dial as 2:21 unwound to 2:19. 2 minutes of causality reversing on his wrist. But his subjective experience did not reverse. He did not feel himself moving backward. He felt stationary, anchored in a single moment while time flowed around him in patterns that defied linear description. The blue glow condensed, concentrated, and through the atmospheric distortion, the wildlife observer saw what his eyes had missed the first time. The structure, geometric, angular, dark material absorbing every photon that struck it. Hovering 50 feet above the desert floor, at least 100 feet across, far larger than the recovered footage had suggested. And it was rotating, slowly, each revolution creating visible ripples in the surrounding air, distortions in space-time itself, bending light and chronology in concentric waves that radiated outward from the structure like rings from a stone dropped in still water. His cameras stopped recording. All of them. Simultaneously. His phone would not respond. His legs would not move. A beam of light emerged from the structure's center, soft, blue, the same wavelength as the dome glow. It touched the ground a few feet from where the wildlife observer stood paralyzed. And where it touched, time rippled. He could see it, actually see temporal distortion as a visual phenomenon. The rocks and plants in the beam's radius aged and rejuvenated in rapid cycles, seasons compressing into seconds, growth and decay oscillating like a time-lapse film played forward and backward simultaneously. The beam moved toward him. Slowly, deliberately. It touched his foot. And time fragmented. He was standing in the desert at 2:21 a.m. He was also standing there at 2:19 a.m. and at 2:23 a.m. All simultaneously. Multiple instances of himself occupying the same coordinates at different temporal positions, each version aware of the others, each version experiencing a different moment while sharing the same consciousness. It was not painful. It was annihilating, not of the body but of the assumption that selfhood required a single position in time. He was in several places at once. Several whens at once. The linear narrative of his existence, the unbroken thread from birth to this moment, had been unraveled into parallel strands, each one real, each one him. The beam moved upward through his body, scanning, recording, studying how biological tissue responded to temporal manipulation. And in that state of fragmented chronology, the wildlife observer understood something with a clarity that transcended comprehension. This was not random. This was not malfunction. This was not an accident or a side effect or an unintended consequence of some other operation. The temporal distortions were the purpose. The structure was creating differential time fields and studying how organic consciousness behaved within them. It was an experiment, and he was the subject. The beam reached his head. His consciousness expanded across multiple time frames. He was in the desert. He was in his apartment. He was in conversations that had not yet occurred and conversations that had happened years ago. All of it simultaneous, all of it real. The boundaries between memory and present and future dissolving into a single field of awareness that contained every version of himself he had ever been or would ever be. Then the beam retracted. The structure ceased rotating. Time snapped back into linear flow with a violence that felt physical, a rubber band releasing, a spring returning to rest. The wildlife observer gasped, fell to his knees. His temporal continuity reassembled itself with the disorienting abruptness of waking from a dream that had been more real than waking. When he looked up, the structure was gone. The glow had vanished. The desert was dark and silent and offered no evidence that anything had occurred. His watch read 2:21 a.m. His laptop showed 2:25. 4 minutes of discrepancy. Time on his wrist insisting that almost nothing had passed, while time on his synchronized laptop confirmed that the world had continued for 4 minutes without him. His cameras had stopped recording at 2 hours 21 minutes and 17 seconds. The files simply ended. He sat in the desert for a long time, trying to reconcile the fragmented perspectives that still echoed in his consciousness. He had been inside the distortion field. He had felt time come apart around him. And he understood now that this was larger than isolated incidents, larger than strange lights and missing footage and watches that misbehaved. This was systematic research. Something non-human was conducting experiments on the intersection of time and biological consciousness, studying how organic minds responded to temporal manipulation. And it had been doing so for years, perhaps decades, perhaps far longer. He packed his equipment with hands that would not stop shaking. He needed to contact the field analyst, needed to share what he had experienced. When he reached his truck and checked his phone, he found a text message, sent at 2:21 a.m., from an unknown number. "We see you seeing us. This must stop. Forget what you witnessed. Return to your normal life. Further investigation will have consequences." Someone had sent it during the exact moment of temporal fragmentation. Someone who knew his location. Someone who was watching the watchers. He started his truck and drove away, checking his mirrors continuously. The desert behind him was dark and featureless, and offered no indication that it contained anything other than rock and scrub and the ancient indifference of geology. But the wildlife observer knew better. He was not alone out there. He had never been alone out there. He never returned to that location. He filed his BLM reports, resumed his wildlife observation work, stopped investigating UAPs, but he maintained contact with the field analyst, occasional calls on encrypted channels, carefully worded, both men aware that their communications might not be private. 3 months after the second encounter, the field analyst called with news. "We've mapped the temporal patterns across all documented incidents. Every witness who experienced reverse time was north-northeast of the source. Accelerated time was south-southwest. East and west experienced normal flow with minor deviations." A temporal compass. Exactly. And if we can map these patterns comprehensively, we might be able to predict the next event, position equipment in advance, capture clean footage from multiple bearings. That's dangerous. You saw the message I received. I know. But we're close to something. Encrypted footage showing the structures. Temporal mapping data. Witness testimonies from credible observers. One clean recording, one undeniable piece of evidence, could change everything. And then what? Go public and face whatever sent that message. The field analyst was quiet. Then, "I've been doing this for 8 years. I've seen things that fundamentally altered my understanding of reality. I can't sit on that knowledge. Keeping it hidden feels like lying to the entire human species." The wildlife observer understood. He felt the same gravitational pull toward disclosure. But he also remembered the beam touching his body, the sensation of time splintering around him, the absolute helplessness of a consciousness caught in forces it could not resist or comprehend. "Be careful," was all he said. The field analysts' team continued their work. They positioned monitoring equipment at predicted locations. They captured more encrypted footage, more data, more evidence that something impossible was happening with clockwork regularity in the Nevada desert. But they never obtained the clean recording. The phenomena were too precise in their evasion, too aware of being observed, too sophisticated in their methods of preventing documentation. In June of 2020, the field analyst stopped answering calls. The wildlife observer tried every channel, the encrypted line, the office number, the email address. Silence on all of them. He drove to the research facility. The building was abandoned. Equipment gone. No indication that anyone had occupied the space in months. He asked around. No one knew anything. The security company the field analyst had claimed to work for denied ever employing anyone matching his description. The research laboratory could not be located. The coordinates led to an empty mining site with rusted equipment and locked doors and dust on every surface. It was as though the field analyst had never existed. The Wildlife Observer filed a missing persons report. The police investigated briefly, found nothing actionable, and closed the case. People disappeared in Nevada. The desert did not explain itself to the authorities. But the Wildlife Observer knew. The field analyst had not gotten lost, had not wandered into the desert and succumbed to exposure. He had gotten too close, had accumulated too much evidence, had talked too openly about disclosure. And whatever apparatus existed to maintain the silence, human or otherwise, had reached out and pulled him into it. The phenomena researcher continued her work, collecting testimonies from witnesses around the world, building a database that pointed with increasing precision toward a single conclusion. Humanity was not alone, and whatever shared the planet with us was conducting experiments we barely comprehended. She reached out to the Wildlife Observer occasionally, sharing findings, checking whether he had experienced further anomalies. He always said no. He had learned the cost of looking too closely. The landscape photographer returned to her work. She never saw the triangle again, but she never forgot it. Sometimes she sent brief emails, check-ins, confirmations that both of them were still present, still accounted for, still undisappeared. Small acts of mutual verification between two people who understood that the world contained things capable of making a person simply stop being findable. And the Wildlife Observer kept watching the sky. He monitored his equipment, checked his watch more often than necessary, waited for the blue glow to return. It never did. Either the phenomena had migrated to different coordinates, or he had been flagged, identified as too aware, too curious, too close to the mechanisms that preferred to operate unobserved. But the experience had changed him in ways that could not be reversed. It had dismantled his assumption that time was the simple, linear, universally consistent medium his textbooks had described. It had suggested that consciousness might be more fundamental to the architecture of the universe than matter, that awareness was not a byproduct of biology but a variable that the phenomena specifically sought to study. And it had shown him, in those fragmented moments when he existed at multiple temporal coordinates simultaneously, that reality was a far stranger and more layered construction than any model his species had yet devised. He kept the field analyst's files, the encrypted footage, the temporal mapping data, the incident reports, all of it stored on hard drives in a safe deposit box in a city far from the desert, with instructions attached. If he disappeared, release everything. Insurance against the silence. A dead man's switch built from data instead of dynamite. And sometimes, late at night, he would check his watch and wonder whether time was flowing normally, or whether he was caught in some subtle, undetectable distortion, a residual eddy from the field that had once enveloped him, bending chronology by fractions of a second in ways too small to notice but too real to dismiss. He would remember the sensation of existing in multiple moments simultaneously, the feeling of time fragmenting around him like glass around a stone, the beam scanning upward through his body, recording how his neurons fired when the present tense became plural. He would remember the field analyst's voice saying they were close to understanding. And he would wonder whether understanding was worth the price. Because once you have felt time fragment around you, once you have existed at several points in your own chronology simultaneously, once you have seen the machinery behind the clock face, you never quite trust linear time again. You notice the small discrepancies, the moments when your watch seems slightly off, the conversations that feel like they have happened before, the dreams that carry the texture of memories from futures that have not yet arrived. The truth is out there. Not as a slogan, not as a tagline for entertainment, as a geographical fact. It exists in the Nevada desert, in encrypted camera footage, in the experiences of witnesses who saw too much and cannot prove what they know. The truth is that something is watching us, studying us, manipulating time and space around us with the methodical patience of researchers who have been conducting the same experiment for longer than our civilization has existed. And we are not ready for that truth. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But the structures keep appearing. The temporal distortions keep occurring. The witnesses keep accumulating, each one carrying a fragment of a picture too large for any single person to see in full. And somewhere in the dark spaces between what we know and what we are permitted to know, between the data our instruments capture and the data that is erased before we can examine it, the pattern continues. Systematic, organized, deliberate, patient beyond any human definition of the word. We can only watch, and wonder, and wait, and check our watches, and hope that time, for now, is still moving forward.